The motion alert came in at 2:41 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and I almost didn't open it. I want to start there, with that almost, because I have spent a lot of hours since then thinking about how different my life would look right now if I had just kept driving that day instead of pulling into the parking lot of a hardware supplier on Tunnel Road to check my phone. I run a home security and automation company. I have run it for 11 years. I have installed cameras in probably 1,100 houses across Asheville, North Carolina and the towns around it. Doorbell cameras and driveway cameras and cameras tucked under eaves to watch pools and cameras aimed at back doors because somebody's package kept disappearing. I get motion alerts on my phone all day long, dozens of them, delivery trucks and dogs and wind moving a hanging plant, and after 11 years you learn to glance and dismiss without really looking, because if you looked hard at every single one you would never get anything else done. The one that came in at 2:41 that Tuesday in March was from my own house. Camera 3, the one mounted under the back eave with a clean angle on the sunroom and the kitchen door, the one I had installed myself 2 years earlier on a Saturday afternoon while my daughter rode her bike in circles around the driveway and shouted at me to watch her not use her hands. I glanced at the thumbnail the way I glance at all of them, and something in it stopped my thumb before it could swipe away, and I have never been able to explain what that something was except to say that after doing a job for 11 years, your eyes start to notice when the picture in front of you does not match the story you already believe about your own life. My name is David Corwin. I'm 42 years old, and until that Tuesday in March I would have told you without a single second of hesitation that I had built something rare. 16 years married to a woman named Melissa, 2 kids, a house on Willow Creek Lane in a neighbourhood called Blackwood Estates that we bought when it was still half built and half mud, a business I started in my garage with 4 security cameras, and a used pickup truck that now employs 19 people and does installations from Hendersonville up to Weaverville. I want you to understand that I am not a naturally suspicious man. It is a strange thing to say for somebody who has spent his career installing surveillance equipment in other people's houses, but the truth is I got into this business because I like solving problems with wires and logic, not because I like watching people. I've installed cameras for clients who are convinced their spouse was cheating and been right there next to them, feeling almost embarrassed when the footage showed nothing but an ordinary day. Marriage makes people paranoid sometimes for no reason at all. That is what I believed about other people's suspicion, right up until the moment I sat in my truck in that parking lot and opened the clip from camera 3 and watched my wife of 16 years let a man who was not me into our kitchen through the back door at 2:38 in the afternoon, watched her check the driveway first, watched her lock the door behind him, and watched the 2 of them disappear from the frame in the direction of the stairs with the particular unhurried familiarity of 2 people who had done this before and knew exactly where they were going. I did not throw my phone. I did not call her. I did not start the truck and drive home and kick the door in, which is, if I am honest, the thing some part of me wanted to do so badly in that first minute that my hands were shaking on the wheel. What I did instead, and I think this is the part of the story that matters most, the part that explains everything that came after it, was something that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with 11 years of habit. I opened a second app on my phone, the one I use to manage the private cloud backup server I run out of a locked cabinet in my office, separate from the consumer app that comes with the cameras, separate from anything Melissa had ever seen or asked about, and I confirmed that the clip from camera 3 had already synced. It had. It had synced automatically, the way every clip from every camera in that system synced automatically, the way I had built the system to work from the very first day I installed it. Because in my business, redundancy is not paranoia, it is professionalism. You back up the footage because clients ask for it later, because insurance companies ask for it later, because sometimes the cheap consumer app glitches and loses a file, and a homeowner calls you in a panic wanting to know where their proof went. I had built a habit of protecting footage for other people's protection for over a decade, and on that Tuesday in March, without planning it, without even fully understanding in the moment what I was doing, that habit protected me. I want to be very precise about the timeline here, because precision is going to matter later, and because I have gone back over these dates so many times since that I could recite them in my sleep. It was March the 14th. My son Ethan was 15 years old, a freshman at TC, Robertson High School, the school our neighbourhood of Blackwood Estates was zoned into, and he had a baseball practice that ran until 5:30 that day, which is the only reason the house was empty at 2:38 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. My daughter Zoe was 10 in 4th grade, and she had after-school care until 4:15 because Melissa's schedule as a real estate agent with Bluegrass Realty Group was, according to Melissa, unpredictable, full of showings and closings and clients who wanted to see a property the second they had a free hour. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, the unpredictable schedule, because it is going to come back around later in a way that I did not see coming that day, but that makes a kind of sense now that turns my stomach even after everything else that has happened. 16 years of marriage, 2 kids, a woman I met when I was 25 years old, delivering a load of conduit to a job site where she was interning for an architecture firm before she decided real estate suited her better, a woman who laughed so hard at something I said about the pallet jack breaking that she had to sit down on an overturned bucket, a woman I married at 26 in a backyard ceremony with string lights because neither of our families had money for anything fancier and neither of us cared. That is who I believed I had built a life with. And at 2:41 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in March, sitting in a hardware store parking lot with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing directly into my face because I suddenly could not get enough air, I learned that the life I believed I had built had a second life running underneath it that I had never once suspected, not for a single day, not even the day before. I sat there for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I looked at the clock when I first opened the clip, and I looked at it again when I finally set the phone down in the cup holder. And in between those 11 minutes, I did not cry and I did not scream. I mostly just breathed, in through the nose and out through the mouth, the way I used to do it before a big presentation to a commercial client, because some old, calm, stubborn part of my brain had already decided, before I had even consciously thought the words, that whatever I did next needed to be something I would still respect myself for in a year. I did not know yet who the man was. I could see him from the side and slightly from behind on the thumbnail. Tall, dark hair, athletic build. A grey quarter-zip pullover I did not recognise from any of our friends or Melissa's co-workers. And for those 11 minutes he was simply a shape. A stranger-shaped hole in my marriage that I was going to have to fill in with a name eventually, and some instinct, some old surviving fragment of the calm, methodical person I have always tried to be at work, told me that finding out that name was not going to be the hard part. The hard part was going to be deciding what kind of man I wanted to be, in the space between finding it out and doing something about it. I drove home that day. I want to be honest and tell you that I drove past my own street twice before I actually turned onto it, circling the block like a teenager working up the nerve to knock on a girl's door. Except what I was working up the nerve to do was walk into my own house and act normal. Melissa was in the kitchen when I came in through the garage door at 5:50, exactly the time I always came home, and she was cutting cucumbers for a salad, and she said, "Hey, how was your day?" And I said, "Fine, busy. Denny's crew hit a snag rewiring the Ashford place," and she said, "That's annoying," and I said, "Yeah," and that was it. That was the entire conversation, and I stood in my own kitchen looking at the woman I had loved for 17 years and married for 16 of them, watching her slice a cucumber on the same cutting board I'd bought her for our 5th anniversary, because she'd mentioned once that she wanted a bigger one, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a door quietly closing. Not slamming, just closing, soft and final, somewhere behind my ribs, while my face, I am fairly sure, showed absolutely nothing at all. I need to go back further than that Tuesday, though, because if I only tell you about the discovery and the plan that came after it, you will not understand why I reacted the way I did, and you will not understand why what I eventually did to protect that footage, and to protect my children, and to protect the truth of what had happened in my own home, was not an act of vengeance so much as an act of a man who had spent his whole adult life building things carefully, and refused to let the most important thing he had ever built be destroyed by someone else's carelessness, or by his own panic, or by a woman's ability to talk her way around almost anything if you gave her the chance to see the evidence before you were ready. So let me tell you who Melissa and I were before any of this. And let me tell you about the 11 weeks that came after that Tuesday in March. Because in those 11 weeks I did something that, when I finally showed her what I had, made a woman who had spent 16 years believing she was the smarter one in the marriage go so pale that she had to sit down on our own kitchen floor. I met Melissa Hargrove on a Thursday morning in September 17 years ago, when I was 25 and driving a beat-up flatbed for an electrical supply company, because my own security business was still a year away from existing, just a folder of half-finished business plans and a growing collection of camera equipment I was teaching myself to install on weekends for extra cash. I was dropping a load of conduit and junction boxes at a job site off Biltmore Avenue, where a small architecture firm was renovating an old warehouse, and Melissa was 22, fresh out of a design program at Appalachian State, interning for that firm and standing in the middle of the site in a hard hat that was too big for her, arguing with a foreman about where a load-bearing wall actually was on a set of blueprints she was holding upside down without realizing it. I corrected her gently, and she turned the blueprint right side up, looked at it for 3 full seconds, went red in the face, and then laughed so hard and so suddenly that the foreman jumped. I liked her immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was, dark hair and quick brown eyes, and a way of tilting her head when she was about to say something sharp, but because she laughed at herself first before anyone else could get the chance to laugh at her. And I have always thought that quality, laughing at your own mistakes before the world does it for you, was one of the rarest and best things a person could have. We dated for a year. I proposed on a hiking trail above Craggy Gardens, with a ring I had saved for out of 6 months of overtime, and she said yes before I even finished the sentence, which she liked to tell people for years afterward, that I never actually got to ask the full question because she cut me off. We married in her parents' backyard in Weaverville with string lights strung between 2 oak trees and a caterer, who was her cousin's friend, and did the whole thing at cost as a wedding gift. And I remember standing under those lights at 26 years old, thinking that I had never in my life felt more certain of anything than I felt about spending the rest of it with that woman. I started Corwin Home Security a year after we married, working out of our garage with 4 cameras and a used pickup truck, and Melissa believed in it before almost anyone else did, including, some days, me. She did the books for the first 3 years for free because we could not afford to pay anyone. She answered the phone when I was up on a ladder. She talked me out of quitting during a brutal stretch in year 2 when a big commercial contract fell through, and I genuinely considered going back to driving a flatbed for somebody else. I want to be fair here, and fairness matters enormously to me in telling this story, because whatever came later, whatever I found on that Tuesday in March, does not erase the fact that for a long stretch of our marriage, Melissa Corwin was exactly the partner I believed I had married. Ethan was born 2 years after our wedding, a big, loud, easy baby who slept through the night at 10 weeks, and has been sunny and uncomplicated every day of his life since, currently obsessed with baseball to a degree that has our garage permanently smelling of pine tar and leather. Zoe came 5 years after that, a surprise, a happy one, born when Ethan was already 5 and Melissa was 30 and I was 33. A smaller, more watchful child than her brother, the kind of kid who notices when a grown-up's voice changes half a register and asks about it later, quietly, when nobody else is listening. I tell you their ages precisely because ages are going to matter later in this story, when I explain what I was and was not willing to let happen around my own children, and I want there to be no confusion about the fact that on the day I discovered what I discovered, Ethan was 15 and Zoe was 10, and that every single decision I made in the 11 weeks that followed was built around a single, unbending rule I set for myself before I did anything else. Whatever happened to my marriage, it was not going to happen in front of my kids, and it was not going to be my kids who found out from a shouting match in the kitchen or a sheriff's deputy at the door or, worse, from some other parent at school who had heard a rumour before they heard the truth from me. Looking back now, and I want to be honest that hindsight makes a person see patterns that might not have been quite so obvious at the time, there were things in the year and a half before that Tuesday in March that I noticed and explained away, the way I think most people explain away small changes in someone they trust completely. Because trust is not just a feeling, it is also a kind of filter that makes you interpret ambiguous evidence in the most generous possible light. Melissa had started going to a gym called Ironclad Fitness on Sweeten Creek Road, about 14 months before all of this, a nicer, more expensive gym than the YMCA membership she'd had for years, and she'd started going 3, sometimes 4 mornings a week instead of her old twice-a-week yoga class. She lost weight, toned up, bought new workout clothes, started talking about a trainer there named Ryan, who, according to her, was, quote, actually good, unlike the guy at her old gym who just stood around on his phone. I remember being glad about it. I remember thinking, good, she's taking care of herself, she deserves that. We'd both put on the comfortable, unremarkable weight of a marriage with 2 kids and a business that ate 60-hour weeks. And if she wanted to get back some of the energy she'd had at 22, standing in that hard hat arguing with a foreman, I was happy for her. I never once, not for a single day in those 14 months, thought about that gym as anything other than a gym. The schedule changes came gradually enough that I did not clock them as a pattern until much later. When I went back through 18 months of my own memory the way you'd review old security footage frame by frame, looking for the exact moment something shifted. Melissa's real estate schedule had always been somewhat unpredictable. Showings on weekends, closings that ran long, the occasional evening open house. And over that year and a half, the unpredictability seemed to grow, not dramatically. Not in any single moment I could point to and say, there, that's when it changed. But steadily, the way a slow leak in a tyre doesn't announce itself, it just means you're filling it up a little more often than you used to without quite noticing how much more. Tuesday afternoons became a day she was often out showing houses to a client she described, when she described him at all, only as a relocation buyer moving down from Charlotte who worked odd hours and could only view properties midweek. I never met this client. I never saw a name on a closing. I want to be honest that at the time, none of this struck me as suspicious, because Melissa had always had clients I never met. That is simply the nature of a career built on driving strangers through empty houses, and a wife who is telling you a true and boring fact about her day sounds, it turns out, almost identical to a wife who's telling you a carefully constructed lie about her day, right up until you have a reason to compare the two. There was one moment, about 4 months before the Tuesday in March, that I've gone back to more than any other, turning it over in my hands like a stone I keep finding in my pocket. It was a Sunday evening, the kids were both upstairs, and Melissa was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, and her phone buzzed on the nightstand with a text message preview that flashed on the lock screen for the 3 or 4 seconds before it went dark again, and I saw, without meaning to look, without even fully processing what I was seeing until she came back into the bedroom, a name I did not recognize, Ryan C., and a message that read, "In full, missed you today, same time Thursday." I remember my brain doing something strange in that moment, some kind of instant, almost automatic negotiation with itself, telling me that of course a trainer texts his clients about scheduling sessions, that missed you today was just gym speak for you skipped your workout, that I was being the kind of paranoid husband I'd spent years quietly pitying in my own clients, the ones who called me wanting extra cameras pointed at their own driveways because they convinced themselves of something with no real evidence at all. I did not mention the text to Melissa. I told myself I trusted her, and in a strange way I still believe that was true, that the version of trust I had for her was real and not naive. It was just built on 16 years of data that, as it turned out, no longer described the woman generating new data in real time. I think about that Sunday evening a great deal now, because it is the moment I locate, when I am being completely honest with myself, as the last time I was truly, uncomplicatedly happy inside my own marriage without a shadow of doubt somewhere at the edge of it. After that night, I did not become suspicious exactly. I want to be precise about that, because suspicion implies an active, ongoing surveillance of someone's behaviour, and I did not do that, not for 4 months, not until camera 3 did the noticing for me on its own. But something in me shifted from unquestioning to merely trusting, a small distinction that I think most married people would recognise if they sat with it long enough, the difference between never having the thought occur to you at all, and having the thought occur to you once briefly and choosing consciously to set it back down. I set it back down. I told myself a story about a Sunday text message that let me keep sleeping easily next to my wife for 4 more months, and I do not regret that choice, even now, because I think a marriage where you interrogate every ambiguous text message is not a marriage at all. It is a surveillance operation, and I had spent my whole career learning the difference between healthy security and paranoid control. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that the story I told myself that Sunday night was wrong, and that the real story, the one camera 3 showed me 4 months later in 11 seconds of grainy footage from an eave above my own sunroom, had been running underneath my life the entire time, on Tuesday afternoons, while I was out installing cameras in other people's houses to help them find out the truth about their own. I did not sleep that first night. Not really. I lay next to Melissa in the dark, listening to her breathing slow into the rhythm she'd had for 16 years, and I stared at the ceiling and made myself do the one thing my training as an installer had taught me to do before anything else in any job. Assess the full scope of the system before you touch a single wire. I was not going to confront her based on 11 seconds of one clip from one afternoon. Not because I doubted what I'd seen. I did not doubt it for a second. But because I've watched enough television courtroom dramas and, more relevantly, dealt with enough actual divorce lawyers as clients over the years installing security systems in houses mid-split to understand a hard truth. In the state of North Carolina, and in most places, being right is not the same as being prepared. If I walked into that kitchen the next morning and threw one grainy clip on the counter, I would hand Melissa the single greatest gift you can give somebody who has been caught, which is advance warning. She would have time to build a story, to delete things, to call Ryan Castellano, because by the second night I had a name and get their accounts synced up into a matching lie. To cry the specific, effective kind of tears she was extremely good at, the kind that had talked me out of being angry over far smaller things for 16 years. I was not going to make that mistake. What I was going to do instead, starting that very night, lying awake next to a woman I had loved for 17 years, was build a case the way I would build a system, quietly, redundantly, and completely, before I ever let her know that I knew anything at all. The first thing I did, the very next morning, before I'd even had coffee, was make absolutely certain that every camera in my house was backing up correctly and that Melissa had no way to know it. This is the part of the story I think people find hardest to believe, so let me explain exactly how it worked, because it matters. When I installed our home security system 2 years earlier, I had set it up the way I set up every client system, with a consumer-facing app that anyone in the household could log into and view live feeds or recent clips. The kind of app you'd use to check who's at the front door or make sure the kids got home from school on time. Melissa had that app on her phone. She knew about the cameras, obviously we both did, we had installed them together, mostly for package theft and to keep an eye on the kids' comings and goings as they got older. But what Melissa did not know, what I had genuinely never mentioned to her, not out of any deception but simply because it had never come up, was that I also ran every single client installation, including my own house, through a second layer, a private encrypted backup server that copied every clip automatically to 2 separate locations, a cloud storage account under my business name, the kind of thing insurance companies and occasionally lawyers had requested from me in the past when a client needed footage for a legal case, and a physical hard drive in a locked fireproof safe bolted to the floor of my office at Corwin Home Security, a habit I had built over a decade because footage disappearing at the worst possible moment, whether from a corrupted app or a homeowner who panicked and deleted something they shouldn't have, was the single most common complaint I heard from clients who came to me after using a cheaper system. I built my entire business on the principle that footage you cannot fully trust is worse than no footage at all. I'd simply never imagined, not once in 11 years, that the client whose footage I would one day need to protect most urgently from being deleted would be myself, in my own house, against my own wife. That clip from camera 3, the one that came in at 2:41 on that Tuesday, had already synced to both backups by the time I sat in that parking lot watching it. Because that is how the system had been built to work from day one, automatically, silently, requiring no action from me at all. What I did over the next several days was not create that protection. It already existed. What I did was make sure it stayed protected going forward, and make sure Melissa could never find a way to undo it, even if she somehow discovered the system existed. I changed the master administrator password on the backup server from my office that Wednesday morning, told my staff it was a routine security update, which was not even a lie. Cybersecurity in this business is something you update constantly, and I quietly removed Melissa's device from the list of authorized viewers on the backup dashboard, though I left her access to the ordinary consumer app completely untouched. This is a detail I want to explain carefully because it was deliberate. I wanted Melissa to keep behaving normally, keep believing that the only footage that existed was whatever she could see or delete through the app on her own phone, the app that showed only a rolling 30-day window of clips before the system automatically cleared space for new ones. If she ever noticed the clip from that Tuesday sitting in the app and grew nervous and deleted it herself, thinking she had erased the evidence, I wanted her to feel that false relief. I wanted her to believe right up until the moment I chose to show her otherwise that she had gotten away with it, because a person who believes they have gotten away with something behaves very differently and often far more carelessly than a person who knows they are being watched. I did something else that first week that I am not entirely proud of, though I have made my peace with it since, which is that I began, very carefully and very rarely, to check the archived footage myself. Not obsessively, not every day, because I could not have functioned at work or with my kids if I had let myself do that, but enough to establish a pattern, enough to answer the question that was eating a hole in my chest larger than the one the first clip had already carved there. Was this a single afternoon, a single mistake, or was this a life? I found my answer inside 9 days. Ryan Castellano, a name I learned from watching him climb out of a grey sedan on a different Tuesday, and glancing at the mailbox number before he came round back, 35 years old, according to the business license search I ran that Wednesday night on the ironclad fitness ownership records, the sole registered owner of the gym Melissa had been attending for 14 months, had been coming to my house on 11 separate occasions over the previous 5 months alone, always on a Tuesday or a Thursday afternoon, always between 2:15 and 4, always gone before 4:15 when Zoe's after-school pickup window would have brought Melissa back out of the house anyway. A scheduling precision that told me this was not a man swept up in a moment of weakness. This was a man and a woman who had built deliberately and with real logistical care a second relationship that ran parallel to my marriage for the better part of half a year, timed around my work schedule and my children's school days with the same careful attention I put into wiring a house so that no two circuits would ever cross and short each other out. I want to tell you what those 9 days did to me, because I think it is important, and because I do not think enough people talk honestly about what the waiting period after a discovery like this actually feels like from the inside. It was not constant, dramatic grief, the kind you see in movies, a man sobbing on his knees. It was quieter and stranger than that, a low, steady hum of disbelief underneath every ordinary thing I did. Brushing my teeth, driving to a job site, sitting through my son's baseball practice in a folding chair, while other dads talked to me about the Panthers draft picks, and I nodded and said the right things, and felt like I was watching myself do it from about 6 feet to the left of my own body. I would look at Melissa across the dinner table, watching her cut Zoe's chicken into smaller pieces the way she always had, listening to her ask Ethan about his math test, and some nights I genuinely could not reconcile the woman doing those ordinary, loving things with the woman I had watched in grainy black and white footage from a camera I myself had mounted under our own eave, unlock our back door for another man on 11 separate Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I did not hate her in those 9 days, and I think that surprised me more than almost anything else. What I felt was closer to a strange suspended grief, like standing at a funeral for someone who is still, technically, walking around and asking you to pass the salt. By the end of that first week I had also done something that I think surprised even me, with how naturally it came, which is that I called a lawyer. Not Melissa's lawyer, obviously not our family's lawyer, a general practice attorney named Warren Kessler who had drawn up our wills years earlier and would have had an obvious conflict of interest, but a family law attorney I found through a client of mine, a woman named Patricia Hensley, whose office was on Church Street downtown, whose reputation, according to my client, was for being quiet, thorough, and absolutely ruthless in the actual courtroom when the moment called for it. I did not tell Patricia Hensley everything in that first phone call. I told her I suspected my wife of infidelity, that I had some preliminary evidence, and that I wanted to understand before I did anything else what North Carolina law actually said about marital misconduct, about equitable distribution, about alimony, and about what kind of evidence would actually hold up if this eventually became a legal matter rather than just a private one. I remember her asking me one question in that first call that reframed the entire next 11 weeks of my life. She asked me, "Do you want to save this marriage, or do you want to be able to prove, beyond any doubt, exactly what happened in it?" I sat with that question for a long moment, in my truck, in a different parking lot this time, and I told her the truth, which was that I did not know yet which one I wanted, but that I knew for certain I wanted the option to do either one, and that meant I needed proof so complete that Melissa could never talk her way around it, whichever path I eventually chose. Patricia Hensley gave me homework in that first meeting, sitting across from her in an office lined with law books on Church Street, and she said something I've never forgotten, which is that judges and juries do not convict on suspicion, they convict on patterns, and patterns require documentation that exists outside of memory, because memory, even an honest one, gets picked apart in a deposition. She told me that if I truly wanted to protect myself financially, and eventually my children, I needed 3 separate categories of evidence, not just the footage itself. I needed proof of the affair's duration, which I already had building steadily in the archived clips. I needed proof of what she called marital waste, meaning any shared money that had been spent directly or indirectly supporting the affair, gifts, hotel rooms, dinners, anything that came out of an account that was legally half mine. And I needed my own financial house to be in order, separate accounts properly documented, our joint assets clearly inventoried, before I ever let Melissa know that anything had changed, because the moment she knew, Patricia warned me, people in her position sometimes did something desperate, moved money, ran up joint credit cards, tried to hide assets of their own. I remember asking Patricia if that was common, spouses hiding assets once they knew a divorce was coming, and she looked at me for a long moment before she answered and said, "In my experience, Mr. Corwin, it is not the exception. It is closer to the rule, and I would rather you assume it is coming and be wrong than assume it isn't and be blindsided." So over the next several weeks, alongside the quiet, careful accumulation of footage, I began doing something that felt almost like running a second business on top of my real one. A forensic audit of our own marriage's finances, conducted entirely after hours, at my kitchen table or in my office, always after Melissa had gone to bed. I pulled 20 months of statements from our joint checking account, our joint credit card, and a home equity line of credit we had opened 3 years earlier to finance an addition on the house, a sunroom, ironically, the very room Camera 3 had such a clean angle on. What I found, laid out across a spreadsheet I built late at night with the kind of obsessive colour coding I usually reserve for wiring diagrams, was a pattern of small, deniable withdrawals that on their own meant nothing but together painted a very specific picture. A recurring charge of $89 a month to Ironclad Fitness that I had always assumed was Melissa's gym membership and never once questioned, which turned out, when I finally called the gym directly under the pretense of asking about a corporate membership for my own employees, to be the base rate for unlimited personal training sessions, a service that, when I quietly asked a different employee at the front desk what the going rate actually was, should have been closer to $320 a month, meaning someone, somewhere, had been discounting Melissa's sessions by more than 70% for over a year, a discount that had never once been reflected as a separate line item, a discount I now understood with a kind of cold clarity was Ryan Castellano's way of subsidizing his own affair using the profits from his own business, which meant, absurdly, that some of the money I'd spent on my wife's gym membership had been quietly funding the very thing destroying my marriage. I found 4 hotel charges over 8 months at a Hampton Inn off Interstate 40 near the airport, always on our joint credit card, always coded innocuously as travel or lodging, always on days Melissa told me she was driving a relocation client to look at properties in Hendersonville or Brevard, always amounts small enough, $61, $74, that I'd never once flagged them on a statement crowded with far larger, more obvious expenses, groceries and gas, and Ethan's baseball registration fees. I found a jewellery store charge for $340 in November that Melissa had told me at the time was a birthday gift for her sister in Charlotte, a gift I now had no way of confirming her sister had ever actually received, because I was not about to call my sister-in-law and ask her directly, not yet, not while I was still building a case rather than starting a war. Each individual charge, taken alone, was the kind of small mystery every marriage absorbs without a second thought. Taken together, laid out on a spreadsheet with dates cross-referenced against the 11 documented visits from the security footage, they built something I could not unsee anymore. A second household, essentially, a second relationship with its own gifts and its own hotel stays and its own private jokes I would never be part of, funded in part by money that belonged, legally and morally, to our family. There was one moment during those weeks that nearly ended everything I was building before I was ready, and I think about it often, because it is the moment that taught me exactly how careful I still needed to be. It was a Thursday evening in early April, about 3 weeks into my quiet documentation, and I was in my home office with the door mostly closed, going through hotel statements on my laptop, when Ethan walked in without knocking, the way 15-year-olds do, wanting to ask if he could go to a teammate's house that weekend, and he glanced at my screen for half a second before I minimized it, just long enough, I realized later with a jolt of pure fear, to see the words Hampton Inn and a string of dates. He didn't say anything about it that night, and for 2 full days I genuinely did not know whether my son had understood what he'd seen or simply registered it as boring adult paperwork and moved on, the way teenagers usually do with anything that isn't about them. But on the Saturday after, driving him to a baseball tournament in Hickory, just the 2 of us in the truck for an hour and 10 minutes, Ethan asked me, out of nowhere, staring straight ahead out the windshield instead of at me, whether Mum and I were doing okay, and something in the careful, deliberate casualness of the question told me that my son, at 15, had picked up on something in the air of our house that I had believed I was hiding perfectly. I made a decision in that truck, in about 4 seconds, that I have never regretted, which was to tell my son a version of the truth that was honest without being destructive. I told him that your mother and I are working through some things, that grown-up marriages sometimes go through hard stretches, that it had nothing to do with anything he or Zoe had done, and that whatever happened, he and his sister were never ever going to be asked to choose a side or carry information that wasn't theirs to carry. I told him I needed him to trust me for a little while without asking me for details I wasn't ready to give him yet, and I watched my 15-year-old son, who has always been easier and sunnier than I probably deserved as a kid, nod slowly and say, "Okay, Dad," and then, after a pause that felt like it lasted an hour, "Just take care of yourself too, not just us," which is a sentence I am not sure I will ever fully get over hearing from my own child. I did not cry in front of him. I waited until I dropped him at the tournament check-in table and had 90 seconds alone in the truck before the next group of parents arrived. And in that 90 seconds, for the first time since Camera 3 sent me that alert in March, I let myself fall apart completely, both hands gripping the steering wheel before I wiped my face, put on sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and went to go watch my son's baseball game like a normal father having a normal Saturday. I want to pause here and tell you something about Zoe as well, because she features in this story in a smaller but, to me, equally important way. Zoe was 10 that spring in 4th grade, and unlike her brother, she did not ask direct questions. She simply became, over those weeks, quieter around her mother in a way that broke my heart precisely because I could not tell whether it meant anything at all, or whether it was simply the ordinary moodiness of a 10-year-old going through a growth spurt. One night in late April, she climbed into my lap while I was reading in the living room, which she had mostly stopped doing over the past year because she considered herself too old for it, and she asked me, apropos of nothing, whether people can love two people at the same time. I remember my whole body going still, wondering with a spike of pure adrenaline whether she had somehow seen or heard something. But when I asked her gently why she was asking, she said it was because of a book she was reading at school about a girl whose parents were divorced, and she wanted to know if that meant nobody had loved anybody properly in the first place. I told her that sometimes people love each other truly, and it still isn't enough to keep them together, and that loving somebody and staying married to them forever are not actually the same promise, even though people often talk about them as if they are. She thought about that for a long time, resting her head against my chest, and then she said, "I think I'd still want you to read to me even if you and Mum didn't live in the same house," which is a sentence a 10-year-old should never have to reassure her father with, and which told me, more clearly than any spreadsheet or any hotel statement, exactly how much was at stake and how carefully I handled everything that was still to come. By the middle of April, about 5 weeks into what I had started thinking of, privately, as the documentation period, I brought in one more person to help me, a longtime friend and my company's operations manager, a man named Gary Wooten who had worked beside me for 9 years and knew me well enough to notice, before I ever said a word, that something was wrong. Gary is the kind of quiet, steady man who has installed cameras in more houses than almost anyone else on my crew, and he has also, over the years, done a handful of side jobs for local attorneys, discreet surveillance work, licensed and above board, the kind of thing security professionals sometimes get pulled into when a divorce lawyer needs corroborating evidence beyond what a spouse can gather on their own. I told Gary the truth on a Friday afternoon in my office. Door closed, and I watched a man who has a poker face better than mine go very quiet and very still, and then say simply, "David, I'm so sorry," and then, after a pause, "What do you need me to do?" What I needed him to do, and what he agreed to without a second thought, was to conduct 3 separate days of legal licensed surveillance on Ryan Castellano directly. Watching the Hampton Inn parking lot from a public street on 2 of the Tuesdays, my own footage predicted he would show up, and photographing, from a legal public vantage point, both vehicles arriving and both individuals entering the same room. This was not about catching anything new. I already had more than enough from my own cameras. This was about corroboration, about making sure that no lawyer Melissa ever hired could argue that the footage from my house had somehow been altered or misrepresented, because now I would have a second, independent source, a licensed operator's photographs, time-stamped and notarized, telling the identical story. Gary came back to me on a Wednesday in late April with a manila folder of photographs and a short written report, and he told me something that I had not expected, which complicated the picture in a way that made my stomach drop even further than I thought it could go. He told me that on the second day of surveillance, Ryan Castellano had not gone to the Hampton Inn at all. He had gone instead to a jewellery store downtown, the same jewellery store I would later confirm by cross-referencing our credit card statement, where the $340 November charge had originated, and he had spent close to 40 minutes inside. Gary had not been able to see what was purchased. Obviously, that would have required going inside himself and drawing attention. But he had photographed Ryan leaving with a small bag from the store, and the timing, 3 days before what would have been Melissa's and my 16th wedding anniversary, sent a cold, specific dread through me that had nothing to do with what I already knew, and everything to do with what I was suddenly afraid might be coming. I remember sitting with that folder in my lap for a long time that Wednesday night, turning over the horrifying possibility that this was not simply an affair being conducted in parallel to my marriage, but something Ryan Castellano might be preparing to escalate, and I called Patricia Hensley the next morning in something closer to genuine panic than I had allowed myself to feel in the 5 weeks since that Tuesday in March. Patricia's response steadied me, the way it usually did. She reminded me that whatever was in that bag, whether it was a plain gift or something more symbolic, it changed nothing about the plan we had already built, and that the worst thing I could do was let a new piece of information rush me into confronting Melissa before I was ready. She told me something I've repeated to myself many times since. The temptation, when you discover something is worse than you thought, is to act faster, and it is almost always the wrong instinct, because worse news means you need more preparation, not less. She was right, and I forced myself to sit with the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing what was in that bag for what turned out to be another 6 weeks, watching my wife wear, on 2 separate occasions at family dinners, a thin gold bracelet I did not recognize and had not given her, which she explained, when I asked her directly in as neutral a voice as I could manage, as something she'd, quote, treated herself to after closing a big sale, a lie so smooth and so immediate that it frightened me more than the bracelet itself did. Because it told me Melissa had gotten good at this, practiced at it, comfortable in a way that suggested this had been going on, in some form, for far longer than the 14 months I had been able to document through the gym and the security footage combined. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living 2 lives at once, and by early May I understood it in a way I never had before, because that is exactly what I had built for myself without fully intending to. During the day, I was David Corwin, business owner, father, husband, going to Ethan's baseball games and helping Zoe with her fractions homework, and eating dinner across from a woman I greeted every morning with the same kiss on the cheek I had given her for 16 years, a kiss that had started to feel, by that point, like a performance I was giving for an audience of exactly 1 person who did not know she was watching a performance at all. And then, after the kids were asleep, after Melissa had gone to bed believing her husband was simply a man who liked staying up late doing paperwork for the business, I became someone else entirely. A man building a legal case against his own wife, with the same meticulous attention I would bring to wiring a hospital or a bank vault, cross-referencing dates, organising photographs, drafting timelines, and speaking in hushed phone calls to a lawyer whose name was never once mentioned inside the walls of my own house. I lost 11 pounds during those weeks without trying to. I stopped sleeping more than 4 or 5 hours a night. Gary told me once, in the parking lot outside our office, that he was worried about me, that I looked like a man being slowly hollowed out from the inside, and I told him the truth, which was that I felt hollowed out, but that the hollowing was temporary and the alternative, acting before I was ready and losing everything I was trying to protect for my kids, was permanent, and I was willing to be hollow for a few months if it meant not being broken for the rest of my life. The moment that finally told me I was as ready as I was ever going to be came in late May, roughly 10 weeks after that first alert from Camera 3, when Patricia Hensley called me into her office and laid out on a conference table the complete case file we'd built together, 11 documented visits to the house, each with time-stamped, backed-up footage from 2 independent storage locations. 4 hotel visits corroborated by both credit card statements and Gary's licensed surveillance photographs. A pattern of discounted gym sessions establishing the length and financial dimension of the relationship, a jewellery purchase 3 days before our anniversary, the contents of which I still did not know but which Patricia said, correctly, no longer mattered, because the pattern surrounding it was already more than sufficient. And a full financial inventory of our marital assets, our house, both our retirement accounts, the business, which under North Carolina law remained primarily mine, as a premarital asset that I had built before we married, though its growth during the marriage would still be subject to some division, all of it organised and ready to be filed the moment I gave the word. Patricia looked at me across that table and asked me the same question she had asked me 11 weeks earlier, whether I wanted to save the marriage or end it, and this time I did not hesitate before I answered her, because 10 weeks of watching my wife lie to my face with a steadiness that frightened me had answered the question for me long before Patricia asked it a second time. I chose our 16th wedding anniversary as the date, deliberately, and I want to explain why, because I know it might sound, on its surface, like an act of cruelty, using an anniversary as the setting for the end of a marriage. It was the opposite of cruelty, or at least it was intended as the opposite, though I understand if Melissa would describe it differently. I chose that date because it was the one evening I could arrange, without raising a single question, for both kids to be elsewhere, Ethan at a sleepover with his teammate whose family had already invited him weeks earlier, Zoe at a much-anticipated overnight at her cousin's house in Weaverville, that Melissa's own sister had organised for entirely unrelated reasons. I chose that date because Melissa herself had suggested weeks earlier, before any of this had come to a head, that we do something special for our anniversary this year. 16 felt like a real milestone to her, she'd said, and I remember, even then, a strange and sorrowful clarity settling over me at the idea that the woman asking me to plan something special for our anniversary was, at that very moment, still receiving gifts from another man's 40-minute jewellery store visit. I told her I would take care of everything, that she should just come home from her Tuesday showings, our anniversary fell on a Tuesday that year, and let me handle dinner, and she smiled at me in our kitchen in a way that still, even now, catches in my throat a little when I think about it, because it was warm and it looked completely genuine, and I have had to accept that both of those things, her affection for me and her deception of me, were probably true and running side by side inside her at the exact same time, in a way I will likely never fully understand no matter how many hours I spend trying. Our anniversary that year fell on the second Tuesday in June, and by the time it arrived I'd spent 11 weeks since that first alert from Camera 3 living a version of my life so carefully compartmentalised that I sometimes felt, driving home from Patricia Hensley's office for the final time, with a folder of signed, finalised divorce paperwork sitting on my passenger seat, like two entirely different men occupying the same body on a rotating schedule. Patricia had prepared everything I would need well in advance of that evening. A formal complaint for absolute divorce, ready to be filed the following morning, grounds cited as adultery, which under North Carolina law can affect both alimony determinations and the equitable distribution of marital assets when one spouse's misconduct is clearly documented. A full evidentiary binder containing still images pulled from the security footage, the hotel statements, the gym discount records, and Gary's licensed surveillance photographs, each item labelled, dated and cross-referenced, and a temporary restraining order request prepared and ready to file. Not because I believed Melissa posed any physical danger to me or the children, I want to be clear about that, but because Patricia insisted, as a matter of standard practice, that we be prepared for every contingency once the confrontation happened and emotions were unpredictable. I spent the Sunday and Monday before our anniversary doing something that felt almost sacrilegious in its ordinariness. I continued being exactly the husband and father I had always been, coaching Ethan through batting practice in the backyard, helping Zoe pack her overnight bag for her cousin's house with the particular ceremony of a 10-year-old who needs to bring 4 stuffed animals for what is technically a one-night trip, sitting beside Melissa on the couch Sunday evening watching a home renovation show she liked, her feet tucked under my leg the way she had done since the earliest years of our marriage, and feeling in that specific moment an ache so total that it nearly broke my resolve, not because I doubted what I knew, but because I understood, with total clarity for perhaps the first time, that the version of Melissa capable of tucking her feet under my leg on a Sunday evening, while an affair ran quietly underneath our entire life, was not a separate person from the version who had built a home with me for 16 years. They were the same woman. Human beings, it turns out, are able to hold contradictions that should be impossible to hold, and watching her hold hers so effortlessly taught me something uncomfortable about how much any of us truly know about the person sleeping beside us. On Monday night, the eve of our anniversary, I drove to my office after Melissa had gone to bed, and I did something I had been putting off for weeks, out of a kind of superstitious caution, even though I knew, logically, it was already unnecessary. I made a third, entirely separate backup of every piece of footage and every document in the case, copied onto 2 physical flash drives, one of which I left in the fireproof safe at my office, and one of which I gave, in a sealed envelope, to Gary, with instructions that under no circumstances was it to be opened or referenced unless I specifically told him to, and that if anything ever happened to me, anything at all, an accident, an illness, anything, he was to give that drive directly to Patricia Hensley and to no one else. I want to be honest that this felt in the moment like an overreaction, the kind of precaution a person takes when a slow-burning 11-week ordeal has quietly reshaped their sense of what could go wrong in the world. But I had spent my entire career telling clients that the appropriate amount of redundancy is always one layer more than feels necessary, because the layer that feels unnecessary is exactly the layer that saves you the one time something genuinely goes wrong, and I was not going to abandon that principle at the exact moment it mattered most in my own life. Tuesday morning, the day of our 16th anniversary, Melissa left for what she told me was a 9 o'clock showing in Arden and a closing downtown at 11, and she kissed me at the door and said, "Tonight's going to be special, I can feel it," and smiled in a way I've turned over in my memory more times than I can count since, trying to decide whether there was anything underneath that smile besides ordinary affection, some flicker of guilt or nervousness, and I have never been able to decide, even now, whether I simply could not see it or whether it truly was not there at all, whether by that point she had compartmentalized her own life so completely that Tuesday mornings kissing her husband goodbye and Tuesday afternoons letting another man into our kitchen had become, for her, two entirely unconnected categories of experience that never touched each other in her own mind. I drove Ethan to his teammate's house myself that morning before his sleepover started properly that evening, an errand that let me hug my son a beat longer than usual in the driveway, not saying anything about what was coming, because I had decided weeks earlier that neither of my children would carry the weight of that specific Tuesday. They would simply know, eventually, gently, that their parents' marriage had ended, without ever having to know the exact evening it happened or picture the specific scene inside that kitchen. I spent that entire day at the office in a state I can only describe as a strange, focused calm, the eye of a storm I'd spent 11 weeks building around myself. I checked in with Patricia twice, confirmed with Gary that the paperwork was staged and ready, and around 4 in the afternoon I drove to the grocery store and bought exactly what I would have bought for a genuine anniversary dinner: a good cut of steak, the wine Melissa liked, candles, because I wanted the evening to look from the outside, from her perspective walking in the door, exactly like the anniversary she believed she was walking into, and because some part of me, a part I'm still working through even now, wanted her to understand fully, in the moment I showed her the truth, the precise size of the gap between the evening she thought she was having and the evening I had actually built. I was not trying to be cruel. I want to say that clearly and mean it. I was trying to make sure that when I finally spoke, there would be no ambiguity left in the room for her to hide inside. No version of the evening she could later tell herself, or tell other people, that softened what had actually happened, because I had learned, over 11 weeks of watching her lie with total fluency, that ambiguity was the one resource she had left, and I intended to remove it completely before the night was over. By 6:30, the table was set, the candles were lit, the steaks were resting, and I stood in my own kitchen in a blue button-down shirt Melissa had bought me 2 anniversaries earlier, listening for the sound of her car in the driveway, feeling something that I can only describe as the strange calm of a man standing at the very end of a bridge he has spent 11 weeks building plank by plank in the dark, finally able to see, for the first time, exactly how far the drop was going to be on the other side, and finding, to his own surprise, that he was not afraid of it anymore. Melissa came home at 6:41. I remember the exact time because I glanced at the stove clock the second I heard her car in the driveway, and she walked in through the garage door carrying a small gift bag and wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, and she stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and put a hand to her chest and said, "David, this is beautiful. Look at all this." And for one full second, one single second that I am not ashamed to admit nearly undid 11 weeks of careful planning, I almost let myself simply have the evening she thought we were having. I almost poured the wine and lit the candles, and let one more night pass in the comfortable false peace we had been living in since March. I did not. I pulled out her chair the way I always had, and I said, "Sit down, I want to talk to you before dinner." And something in my voice, some flatness I had not fully intended, made her expression flicker just slightly. The smallest crack in the smoothness she had worn so effortlessly for 11 weeks. And she sat, still holding the gift bag in her lap, and said, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "No, Melissa, it isn't, and I don't think it has been for a while, and I need you to just listen for a few minutes before you say anything at all. I want to walk you through exactly what I said next, as close to word for word as memory allows, because I rehearsed this moment more times than I could count over those 11 weeks, and when it finally came, it came out steadier than I expected. I told her that on March the 14th, at 2:41 in the afternoon, a motion alert from camera 3, the one I had installed under our own back eave, had shown me a man letting himself into our kitchen through the back door, while she checked the driveway first. I watched her face go from confusion to a kind of dawning, horrified stillness as I said it, her hand tightening around the gift bag until the paper crinkled. I told her his name, Ryan Castellano, before she could try to claim she didn't know who I meant, and I watched something in her collapse very slightly at hearing it said aloud in our own kitchen, in my voice, for the first time. And then I told her the part that I think genuinely broke something in her composure, more than the discovery itself did, which was that the footage had already been backed up, automatically, the moment it was recorded, to a private server she never knew existed, completely separate from the app on her phone, and that even if she had found that clip and deleted it herself at any point over the past 11 weeks, believing she had erased the only copy, it would have changed absolutely nothing, because I had never once been depending on footage she had any ability to touch. Melissa's first reaction was not what I expected, and I think about it often, because I had spent 11 weeks imagining this conversation dozens of different ways, and in almost none of those imagined versions did she go quiet the way she actually did. She set the gift bag down on the table with a very careful, controlled motion, as if setting down something breakable, and she said, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier warmth, "How long have you known?" And I told her, 11 weeks since the day it happened. And I watched the math of that land on her face, watched her realise that every single dinner, every school event, every ordinary evening on the couch over those 11 weeks had been happening while I already knew, while I had already been quietly building a case, and I think that realisation, more than the affair itself being discovered, is what finally cracked her all the way open, because she said, "You've been lying to me for 11 weeks, with something that sounded unbelievably almost like accusation." And I said, "Melissa, I want you to hear how that sentence sounds coming out of your mouth right now." And for a long moment she just stared at me, and something in her face changed again, moving past shock into something more like fear. She tried for a while to minimize it, the way I think Patricia had warned me people often do in that first raw hour. She said it wasn't what I thought, that it had started as just friendship, just someone to talk to during a hard stretch when she'd felt invisible in our marriage, and I let her say all of it without interrupting, because Patricia had told me that too. Let her talk first, because whatever she says in that first unguarded hour will either match the evidence or it won't, and you need to hear which one it is before you show her anything else. It did not match. She said it had been going on for 4 months. I told her calmly that I had 11 separate documented visits to this house, alone stretching back 5 months before that, not counting whatever had happened before my own footage started catching it, and hotel records going back 8 months, and a pattern of discounted training sessions suggesting the relationship at Ironclad Fitness predated even that. She said the jewellery was nothing, a birthday gift for her sister, and I told her I had confirmed, quietly, weeks earlier, through channels she would eventually understand, that her sister had never received any such gift, and watched the last piece of her composure go out like a switch being thrown, because she'd clearly believed, right up until that exact sentence, that at least that one lie was safe. There is a moment I will never forget, about 40 minutes into that conversation, when Melissa asked me, in a voice that had gone very small, why I hadn't just confronted her the day I found out, why I'd let it go on for 11 more weeks, watching, documenting, letting her keep lying to my face every single day, and I told her the truth, the same truth I had told myself in that parking lot back in March. Because I have 2 kids who deserved a father, who acted like a grown man instead of a wounded animal. Because I was not going to let this become a screaming match in front of Ethan and Zoe, or a story the whole neighbourhood heard second-hand before they heard it from us directly. And because I had learned, over 11 years of installing security systems in houses mid-divorce, watching couples destroy each other financially and emotionally through panic and impulsiveness, that the person who acts first out of pure rage is almost always the person who ends up worse off in every way that actually matters a year later. I told her I chose to be patient not because I wasn't furious. I was more furious than I had ever been in my life, but because I decided in that parking lot in March that I was not going to let her affair also take my composure, my business, my relationship with my own children, or my future financial security, on top of everything else it had already taken. I showed her the folder then, the physical binder Patricia had prepared, laying it open on the kitchen table beside the untouched steaks and the candles that were still burning, and I watched Melissa go through it page by page with her hands visibly shaking, still photographs pulled from the security footage, the hotel statements highlighted in yellow, Gary's surveillance photographs from outside the Hampton Inn, the gym membership discount records. And I watched something in her finally give way completely when she reached the last page, a printed screenshot of the March 14th footage itself, time-stamped, undeniable, and she put both hands over her face and sat like that for a long time, her shoulders shaking, and when she finally looked up at me she said in barely more than a whisper, "What happens now?" And I told her that I had already filed for divorce, that the paperwork would be submitted the following morning, that grounds would be cited as adultery, and that under North Carolina law, the documented pattern of marital misconduct we now had on record would very likely affect both alimony and the division of certain assets, and that I had brought in an attorney 11 weeks earlier specifically because I was not willing to let her affair also become the thing that determined whether our children's college funds or my business, the one I had built with my own hands starting 9 years before I even met her, survived intact. Melissa did not scream. I think some part of me had braced for screaming, for anger, for her to try to flip the moment into an argument about my own failings as a husband, the classic deflection Patricia had warned me some spouses attempt when cornered. She did not do that, not that night. What she did instead was slide out of her chair onto the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet beneath the sink, and sit there with her knees pulled up to her chest, crying in a way I had only seen her cry twice before in 16 years of marriage. Once when her father died, and once when we lost a pregnancy between Ethan and Zoe, and some old stubborn loyal part of me, the part that had loved this woman since she was 22 years old, standing in an oversized hard hat laughing at her own mistake, wanted badly to sit down on that floor next to her and hold her the way I had held her through both of those other times. I did not do that. I stood where I was, and I let her cry on the floor of our kitchen alone, because I understood with a clarity that felt almost physically painful that comforting her in that moment would have meant absorbing the consequences of her choices back into my own body one more time, the way I had been doing without fully realizing it for years, and I was done doing that. It was almost an hour later, after Melissa had finally pulled herself up off the kitchen floor and moved to sit stiffly at the table again, her makeup ruined, her hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't asked for, but that I had poured for her anyway out of some reflex of 16 years I could not quite switch off even then, that her phone buzzed on the counter where she'd left it, and I watched her flinch at the sound the way you'd flinch at a gunshot. I did not touch her phone. I want to be clear about that. I've never once touched it without her knowledge. But she glanced at the screen from where she sat, and her face did something complicated, guilt and fear and something almost like relief all crossing it at once, and she said quietly, "It's Ryan. He's asking if I'm okay. He says he has a bad feeling," and I told her she could answer it if she wanted, that nothing about this conversation required her to hide her phone from me anymore, because whatever privacy this marriage still owed either one of us had ended in March, whether either of us had acknowledged it until tonight or not. She didn't answer it. She set the phone face down on the table, and it buzzed twice more over the next 20 minutes, and each time she flinched, and each time she left it there, and I think that small, repeated flinch told me something true about where things actually stood between her and Ryan Castellano, that no amount of talking that night would have gotten out of her directly, which is that whatever this relationship had become over 14 months, it had also become its own source of anxiety and complication in her life, not simply an escape from our marriage, but a second set of obligations and secrecies she now had to manage in real time, even in the middle of the worst night of her marriage. At one point, close to 9 o'clock, she asked me, her voice raw, whether I had ever loved her at all these past 11 weeks, whether every dinner and every ordinary evening had been fake on my end too, mirroring what she had done to me, and I told her the honest answer, which was no. I had not been performing love. I had genuinely still loved her during most of those 11 weeks, which was, if anything, the most painful part of the entire ordeal for me, loving someone fully while also knowing with total certainty that the version of her you loved had been quietly, methodically deceiving you the entire time, and that those two facts did not cancel each other out. They simply sat side by side, ugly and true. The way I suspect her feelings for me and her feelings for Ryan had probably been sitting side by side inside her for over a year. Around 9:30, Melissa tried one more approach, and I want to describe it carefully because I think it is instructive for anyone listening to this who might find themselves in a similar position someday. She stopped crying, sat up straighter, and said, in a voice that had gone from devastated to something more controlled, that she wanted to talk about counselling, that plenty of marriages survived affairs, that she was willing to end things with Ryan completely, cut off all contact, go to therapy, do whatever it took, and that surely, after 16 years and 2 children, I owed the marriage at least the attempt at repair before jumping straight to divorce paperwork. I let her finish completely before I answered, because I did not want this to be the moment I lost my composure after 11 weeks of maintaining it. And then I told her something that I had actually discussed at length with Patricia Hensley weeks earlier, anticipating exactly this scenario, which is that the willingness to try counselling after being caught with an airtight case sitting on the table in front of you is not the same thing as the willingness to be honest before you were caught, and that I no longer had any way of knowing whether an offer to fix things made under those specific circumstances, with a folder of undeniable evidence spread across our kitchen table, reflected genuine remorse or simply reflected the fact that she had run out of other options. I told her something else too, something I had turned over in my mind for weeks and needed to say out loud, which is that the affair itself, as devastating as it was not actually the single thing I found hardest to forgive. What I found hardest to forgive, I told her, sitting across from her in the candlelight of a dinner that had gone cold and untouched hours earlier, was the 11 separate afternoons she had let a man into the house where our children slept, into the kitchen where I made their breakfast every morning, into the sunroom we had built an addition specifically to give our family more space to be together in, and that every single one of those 11 afternoons required a level of calculation and precision, watching the driveway, timing Zoe's after-school pickup, that told me this had never once been a moment of weakness she'd simply fallen into. It had been a project, sustained and planned, requiring real, ongoing effort to protect and conceal for the better part of a year and a half, and I told her that a person capable of that level of sustained, careful deception was not someone whose word I could ever fully trust again, whether we stayed married or not, and that no amount of counselling could manufacture trust that had been dismantled that methodically over that long a period. She asked me, near the very end of that conversation, close to 11 at night, whether I hated her, and I remember taking a long time to answer that question honestly, because I did not want to give her either a comforting lie or a cruel one. I told her that I did not hate her, that hating her would actually be simpler than what I actually felt, which was something closer to grief for a version of her and a version of us that I now understood had partly stopped existing a long time before I found out about it, and that the hardest part of the entire 11 weeks had not been the anger. It had been slowly accepting that the marriage I thought I'd been living inside for the last year and a half had actually already ended, quietly from her side long before I got any say in the matter, and that finding out in March hadn't destroyed anything that was still fully intact. It had simply shown me something that had already been broken for a while. Before she left the house that night, staying at her sister's rather than in our bed, which I told her, gently but firmly, was how things needed to be from that point forward, she asked me one last question standing in the garage doorway with an overnight bag I had helped her pack, in careful wordless efficiency, whether I had told the kids anything yet. I told her the truth, that I hadn't, that Ethan and Zoe knew only that their parents had been working through something hard, and that I intended to tell them together, as their parents, in a calm and united way, once we both had a few days to absorb what had happened ourselves, because whatever else was true about the two of us anymore, we were still their parents, and they still deserved a version of this conversation that did not turn them into collateral damage in a war between the two adults who were supposed to be protecting them. Melissa nodded, said okay, and then said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the sound of her own car door opening, I am so sorry, David. I never meant for any of this. And I told her, and I meant it, that I believed she probably hadn't meant for it to become this, that very few affairs start with the deliberate intention of destroying a family, but that meaning to do something and actually doing it are not the same thing, and that the 11 weeks I had spent watching her lie to my face every single day had taught me more than anything else in my whole life, that the damage a person causes is measured by what actually happened, not by what they originally intended. We told Ethan and Zoe together, 4 days after that night in the kitchen, on a Saturday morning, sitting at the same kitchen table where everything had come apart, and I want to describe that conversation carefully because I think it might be the single hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life, harder even than the confrontation itself. Melissa and I had agreed, over 2 brief, painfully civil phone calls in the days between, on a simple script, that we would tell them their parents were getting divorced, that it was not their fault in any way, that both of us loved them exactly as much as we always had, and that would never change, and that we were not going to go into detail about the reasons, because the reasons were between the 2 adults in the marriage, and were not something either of our children needed to carry. Ethan, 15 years old, sat very still through most of it, his jaw tight in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of my own jaw in the mirror lately. And when we finished, he asked only one question, whether he was going to have to switch schools, and when I told him no, that he would stay at Robertson, that the plan was for me to stay in the house on Willow Creek Lane, and for the 2 of them to split time between us in a way we would work out carefully together. He nodded and didn't ask anything else, though I noticed in the days that followed that he started spending a lot more time in the garage, working on his bat, throwing a ball against the side of the house for what sometimes stretched into an hour at a time, a 15-year-old's version, I think, of needing somewhere to put something he didn't have words for yet. Zoe cried, immediately and without restraint, in the specific unguarded way 10-year-olds still can before the world teaches them to perform composure, the way the rest of us eventually learn to, and she asked through her tears whether it was because of something she'd done, whether she hadn't been good enough at something, and hearing my daughter ask that question is a moment I do not think I will ever fully recover from, because it confirmed every fear I'd had for 11 weeks about what this would cost the 2 people who deserved to pay the least for any of it. I pulled her into my lap the way I hadn't in almost a year because she'd decided she was too old for it, and I told her, as clearly and firmly as I have ever said anything in my life, that nothing, absolutely nothing about this had anything to do with her or her brother, that grown-ups sometimes make choices that hurt other grown-ups, and that she and Ethan were the 2 best things either her mother or I had ever done, and that fact was never, under any circumstances, going to change. She asked me again whether I would still read to her, even if she lived somewhere else sometimes, echoing almost exactly the question she'd asked me back in April, without either of us realizing at the time how close to the truth she'd been standing, and I told her yes, every single time it was my turn to have her, for as long as she wanted me to, and something in that promise seemed to steady her, more than anything else I said that whole difficult morning. Ryan Castellano attempted to contact me directly twice in the 2 weeks after the confrontation, both times through text messages to a number I did not recognize at first, and both times I forwarded the messages immediately to Patricia Hensley without responding to him myself on her explicit advice, because anything I said directly to him, she warned me, could complicate matters later if this ever escalated into anything requiring additional legal action. The first message was an attempt at something like an apology, or at least an acknowledgement, saying that he never meant for things to go this far and that he hoped my kids were doing okay, a message that struck me as almost unbearably presumptuous coming from a man who had spent 14 months systematically deceiving my family in my own kitchen. The second message, sent about a week later, was different in tone entirely, defensive, almost accusatory, suggesting that Melissa had told him our marriage was already essentially over before anything between the 2 of them had started, which Patricia told me, when I forwarded it to her, was a common and largely irrelevant claim in cases like this, because North Carolina law does not require a marriage to be perfectly happy for an affair to still constitute legal adultery and still factor into a divorce settlement. It simply requires the marriage to still be legally intact and the affair to have occurred during it, both of which were undeniably true no matter what story either Melissa or Ryan wanted to tell themselves about the state of things beforehand. I learned, through channels I won't fully detail, mostly second-hand through a mutual acquaintance who knew people at Ironclad Fitness, that Ryan Castellano's own situation became considerably more complicated once word of the affair began to spread through certain circles in Asheville. Not because I told anyone myself, I never once discussed the details publicly, but because divorces involving small business owners in a city the size of Asheville rarely stay entirely private, and because, as it turned out, Ryan Castellano was not simply a single gym owner who had made a series of bad decisions. He had a long-term girlfriend of his own, a woman named Priya Desai, who worked as a physical therapist and who, according to the same second-hand channels, had genuinely believed she and Ryan were building a life together. unaware that a significant portion of his Tuesday and Thursday afternoons over the previous year and a half had been spent with a married woman in a Hampton Inn off Interstate 40. I want to be careful here, because I never sought this information out and I take no particular satisfaction in another person's private pain, but I would be dishonest if I told you I felt nothing at all upon learning that the man who had spent 14 months treating my family's stability as something disposable had also, at the exact same time, been doing something similar to a woman who trusted him completely in her own separate life. A pattern that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, that whatever had happened in my marriage had very little to do with anything specific to Melissa or to me, and a great deal to do with a man who had simply never developed the capacity or the willingness to be honest with the people who loved him. Melissa hired an attorney of her own about 10 days after our anniversary, a man named Corwin, who worked out of a firm in Biltmore Park, and I want to describe what happened next because it is the part of this story that surprised me the most, given everything I had already prepared for. I had assumed, based on Patricia's experience with contested divorces, that Melissa's attorney would attempt to challenge the admissibility of the security footage, arguing perhaps that I had violated some expectation of privacy by maintaining a backup system she didn't know about, or that the footage had somehow been selectively edited to misrepresent an innocent situation. Patricia had actually prepared me for this exact argument months in advance, back when we were still building the case, explaining that under North Carolina law, a spouse generally has the right to record activity occurring inside a home they jointly own or reside in, particularly footage captured by a security system installed for the stated and legitimate purpose of home security, and that the fact I had not personally been present during the recorded interactions and had not violated any wiretapping statute by, say, secretly recording private conversations meant the footage was very likely to be considered admissible. Corwin apparently reached the same conclusion himself fairly quickly, because rather than challenge the footage's legitimacy, Melissa's side pivoted almost immediately to negotiating around it, which Patricia told me, with something almost like satisfaction, was the outcome she had expected all along once opposing counsel actually reviewed the strength of what we had assembled. The negotiation itself stretched across roughly 4 months, from late June through early October, and I want to walk through the major points of contention, because I think the financial details matter to anyone listening who might someday find themselves in a similar position, needing to understand what documentation like this can actually accomplish, beyond simply confirming what you already suspected emotionally. The house on Willow Creek Lane, which we had purchased together 9 years into the marriage, and which had appreciated considerably in the years since, was jointly titled marital property, and under equitable distribution, its value was subject to division regardless of fault, though Patricia successfully argued, using our documented mortgage payment history, that my disproportionate financial contributions toward the down payment, made from a business account predating the joint title change, entitled me to a somewhat larger share of the eventual proceeds when we sold it 8 months later. Corwin Home Security, the business I had built for 2 full years before Melissa and I even met, remained substantially my separate property under North Carolina law, though its growth in value during the 16 years of our marriage was legally considered a divisible marital asset, and Patricia negotiated, using a business valuation expert, a settlement in which I retained full ownership of the company while compensating Melissa with a larger share of other marital assets instead, avoiding any scenario in which she might have held any ongoing financial claim on a business my employees and I had built with our own hands. The most significant financial argument, and the one where the documented evidence of the affair mattered most directly, concerned both alimony and what Patricia termed marital waste, meaning marital funds that had been spent supporting an extramarital relationship. Under North Carolina law, marital misconduct, meaning adultery specifically, can be considered by a court both in determining whether alimony is awarded at all and in determining the amount, and a spouse who commits what the law calls illicit sexual behavior during the marriage and prior to separation can, in many cases, be barred from receiving alimony altogether if the other spouse did not engage in comparable misconduct, which, in my case, I had not. A fact Patricia had made sure was airtight from the very beginning of our case by never once, in 11 weeks of documentation and 4 subsequent months of legal proceedings, giving anyone a single reason to question my own conduct throughout the marriage. Using the financial spreadsheet I had built in April, showing the discounted gym membership, the hotel charges, and the jewellery purchase, Patricia argued successfully that not only should Melissa not receive alimony, but that a portion of the marital estate should be adjusted in my favour to account for marital funds that had, in effect, subsidised the affair itself. An argument the mediator in our case ultimately found persuasive enough that Corbin Ash advised Melissa, according to what I later heard through Patricia, to settle rather than risk a judge reaching an even less favourable conclusion at trial. There was one moment during that 4-month negotiation period that I think about often, because it revealed something about how thoroughly Melissa had underestimated for 11 weeks exactly how prepared I had become. During a mediation session in August, held in a conference room downtown with both attorneys present but Melissa and me seated at opposite ends of the same table, Corbin Ash attempted to argue that the hotel charges on our joint credit card, while suspicious, did not conclusively prove infidelity on their own, since Melissa could have simply been meeting a client for a legitimate business reason at a hotel near the airport. A somewhat desperate argument given everything else in the file, but one he apparently felt obligated to at least attempt. Patricia responded by placing without comment a single, printed still image on the table, pulled directly from Gary's licensed surveillance photographs, time-stamped and geotagged, showing Ryan Castellano and Melissa entering the same hotel room together, followed immediately by a second image showing the security footage timestamp from camera 3 on the same date, both individuals leaving my house together earlier that same afternoon before driving separately to the same hotel, and I watched Corbin Ash's expression change in real time as he realised, apparently for the first time, the actual depth of corroborating evidence sitting across the table from his client, and the meeting ended, at his request, 20 minutes early. Melissa did not attend that particular mediation session, with much composure left by its end, and Patricia told me afterward, with the closest thing to warmth I ever heard in her professional voice throughout the entire case, that opposing counsel had privately indicated to her, in a hallway conversation after the session concluded, that he intended to advise his client strongly toward a full settlement rather than proceeding to trial, because he had, in his words, never seen a case arrive this thoroughly documented before litigation had even formally begun. I remember hearing that second-hand account from Patricia, not triumph exactly, but something closer to a quiet, exhausted vindication, the specific and particular relief of 11 weeks of hidden, painful, methodical work finally being recognised by someone with no personal stake in the outcome at all as work that had actually been worth doing. Patricia told me something else that afternoon that I've carried with me ever since, sitting in her office going over the mediator's notes line by line, which is that the majority of contested divorces she had handled over 19 years of practice were decided less by the underlying facts of what actually happened in a marriage, and more by which spouse walked into the negotiation better prepared to prove it. She said most people going through the worst weeks of their lives simply do not have the presence of mind or the professional habits to gather what they need before confronting a partner, and that this was, in her experience, the single greatest and most quietly devastating disadvantage a wronged spouse could hand the person who wronged them, the gift of time to construct a competing narrative before any competing evidence existed to contradict it. She told me my background running a security business, my instinct for redundancy and documentation, had put me in a position maybe one client in 20 ever occupied by the time they sat down in her office for the first time, and that she wanted me to understand that clearly, not to make me feel superior to anyone else going through something similar, but so that I would understand exactly why the outcome of my case had unfolded the way it had, and would be able, someday, to explain it honestly to someone else who needed to hear it. While the legal negotiation stretched through the summer and into the fall, life at home was reorganizing itself around a new, painful architecture that I had never had to design before. The architecture of two parents living apart and trying, despite everything, not to make their children the casualties of it. Melissa had moved into a rented townhouse about 15 minutes away in South Asheville by early July, and we settled, after some initial friction, into a schedule where Ethan and Zoe split their time roughly evenly between us, switching houses every Sunday evening, a rhythm that took months to stop feeling strange and start feeling merely sad in an ordinary, manageable way, instead of freshly devastating every single week. I want to be honest that Melissa, whatever her failures as a wife, never once in all the months that followed tried to use the children as leverage or turn them against me, and I think that fact matters, because it would have been easy, in the bitterness of a contested divorce, for either of us to do real lasting damage to Ethan and Zoe simply by being careless with our own anger in front of them, and to her credit, and to mine, I believe we mostly avoided that particular failure even when we failed at almost everything else that summer. There was a period in early September, though, about 3 months after the confrontation, when Melissa attempted something that I did not expect and that I still think about carefully when I try to be fair to her in telling this story. She asked me, over a stilted phone call about coordinating Zoe's dentist appointment, whether we could talk, just the two of us, away from lawyers and paperwork, and I agreed cautiously to meet her for coffee at a place downtown neither of us had any particular history with. She told me, sitting across from me in a way that reminded me painfully of 100 ordinary conversations we'd had over 16 years, that she had been in individual therapy since July, that she had ended all contact with Ryan Castellano completely the week of our anniversary confrontation and had not spoken to him since, a claim I actually had some ability to verify given the ongoing legal proceedings, and chose, cautiously, to believe, and that she had come to understand, through months of therapy, that the affair had never really been about Ryan at all, that it had been about a version of herself she'd lost somewhere in the exhaustion of building a business, raising 2 kids and running a household, a version she'd felt Ryan's attention briefly resurrected, and that she understood now, with what sounded like genuine and hard-won clarity, that resurrecting a lost sense of herself through deception, rather than through honest conversation with the man she'd actually married, had been a catastrophic and unforgivable shortcut that she would regret for the rest of her life. I listened to all of it, and I want to be honest that some of it moved me, because I do not think Melissa is, or ever was, a cartoonishly evil person. I think she's a flawed human being who made a series of devastating choices over roughly a year and a half, and then compounded them with months of increasingly practiced deception, which is a different and more common thing than pure malice, even if the damage it causes ends up looking identical from the outside. But when she asked me, near the end of that coffee, whether there was any version of the future where we might eventually find our way back to each other, I told her something that I had actually worked out slowly in fragments over the previous 3 months of driving alone between an empty half of a house and my kids' baseball games and dentist appointments, which is that I did not believe I would ever be able to fully separate her in my own mind from the 11 documented afternoons, the discounted gym sessions the jewellery store lie about her sister, and that a marriage without that kind of separation, where every ordinary Tuesday afternoon carried a small permanent echo of suspicion, was not a marriage I believed either of us actually deserved to spend the rest of our lives inside. I told her I forgave her, and I meant that in the sense that I no longer wanted to carry active anger toward her for the rest of my life, but that forgiving someone and choosing to rebuild a life with them again are 2 entirely different decisions, and that I had made the second decision already back in June, sitting in that kitchen watching her cry on the floor, even though it had taken me most of the summer to fully accept that I had made it. The divorce was finalised in early October, 4 months and change after that anniversary confrontation, roughly 7 months after the original discovery in March, with a settlement that gave me the house, which we sold 2 months later and split according to the negotiated formula, favouring my larger initial contribution, full retention of Corwin home security, without any ongoing claim from Melissa, no alimony obligation on my part given the documented misconduct, and a 50-50 custody arrangement for Ethan and Zoe that both of us, whatever else had gone wrong between us, genuinely wanted and had never seriously contested. I remember sitting in Patricia Hensley's office, on the day the paperwork was finalised, signing the last page, and feeling something I had not expected to feel at all, which was not triumph, and not quite relief either, but something closer to the specific tiredness of finally setting down something heavy you have been carrying so long that your body has forgotten what it feels like to walk without it. Patricia shook my hand and told me, with a directness I had come to appreciate over 7 months of working with her, that in 19 years of family law practice she had rarely seen a case where the wronged spouse had protected himself and his children this thoroughly and this calmly, and that whatever came next for me, I had given myself, through 11 weeks of quiet, disciplined work, the best possible foundation to build it on. I want to tell you about one more moment from that autumn, because I think it captures something true about where all of this eventually settled. It was late November, close to Thanksgiving, and I had Ethan and Zoe for the holiday that year according to our new rotating schedule. And Ethan, now 16, home from a fall semester that had clearly toughened something in him, in ways I could see but not fully name, helped me carry the turkey to the table without being asked. The way his own quiet way of processing that whole year had apparently settled into something steadier than the silent batting practice anger of that first spring. Zoe, 11 now, asked if she could say the blessing before we ate, something she had never volunteered to do before, and she said, with her eyes closed and her hands folded with real solemnity, "Thank you for Dad, and for this house, and for Mum too, even though she doesn't live here anymore, and for making sure we still get to see everybody who loves us." And I had to excuse myself briefly to the kitchen, ostensibly to check on the rolls, so that my children would not see their father cry over a turkey on a Thursday afternoon in a house that had cost him more than he had ever imagined a single year of his life could cost, in every sense of that word, and that he had somehow, despite everything, still ended up sitting inside with both of his kids safe and steady on either side of the table. I want to go back and tell you what happened to Ryan Castellano, because I think it matters to the full shape of this story, even though I want to be honest that I only know parts of it secondhand, and I have tried, deliberately, not to make his downfall the centre of gravity of my own healing, because I learned somewhere in those 11 weeks that building your peace around someone else's ruin is its own quiet trap. Priya Desai, the girlfriend I mentioned earlier, the physical therapist who had believed she and Ryan were building a life together, found out about the affair with Melissa sometime in July, roughly a month after my own confrontation. And from what I understand through the same secondhand channels, she did not find out gently or privately. It came out apparently through a mutual friend who had heard about my divorce filing through the ordinary machinery of a mid-sized city's overlapping social circles, and Priya, according to people who knew her, packed her belongings out of the apartment she shared with Ryan within a single weekend and never spoke to him again. I heard months later that she moved to Charlotte to be closer to her sister, and I hope, sincerely and without irony, that she rebuilt something solid for herself, because whatever damage Ryan Castellano did to my family, he appears to have done a comparable version of it to her at the exact same time, and she deserved better than that just as much as my children and I did. Ironclad Fitness, Ryan's gym, lost a noticeable percentage of its clientele over the following year, not because I ever said a single public word about what had happened. I want to be completely clear about that. I never posted anything online, never confronted him publicly, never told anyone outside my own closest circle of friends and family the details of what had occurred. But because Asheville, despite being a city of roughly 95,000 people, has the social density of a much smaller town in certain overlapping professional and social circles, and stories like this one travel through those circles with a momentum that has very little to do with anyone's deliberate effort to spread them. Two members of the small business networking group I belong to, people who had no direct connection to my marriage at all, mentioned to me independently over the following year that they had heard something had happened involving Ryan Castellano and a client's wife, without any specifics attached, and I neither confirmed nor denied it, because by that point I had made a firm decision that my own dignity mattered more to me than any satisfaction I might get from watching a wider audience learn exactly what he had done. Whatever consequences eventually found him, professionally and personally, I believe they found him through the ordinary mechanism of a small city's memory, and a pattern of behaviour that, I suspect, given what happened with Priya, did not begin and did not end with my own wife. I think often about a conversation I had with Gary, my operations manager, about 8 months after the divorce was finalised, sitting in his truck outside a job site waiting for a client to unlock a gate, and he asked me, with the kind of blunt honesty 9 years of friendship earns a person, whether I regretted waiting 11 weeks before confronting Melissa, whether some part of me wished I had simply exploded in that parking lot back in March and let the chips fall wherever rage sent them. I told him no, without hesitation, and I meant it completely, because I had watched, over more than a decade in this business, installing cameras in the aftermath of dozens of other people's marriages falling apart, exactly what impulsive, undocumented anger tends to cost people. I had clients who confronted a cheating spouse the same day they found out, screamed, threw things, sometimes did something rash enough to end up with a restraining order filed against themselves instead of their spouse, and ended up, a year later, with a far worse financial outcome, a far more damaged relationship with their own children, and, in more than one case I can think of specifically, no actual proof strong enough to stop their ex-spouse from rewriting the entire story afterward to anyone who would listen, including, sometimes, their own kids as those kids got older. I told Gary that the 11 weeks had cost me something real, sleep, weight, a version of easy trust in the world I don't think I will ever fully get back, but that they had also given me something I believe was worth every single sleepless night. which was the ability to walk away from that marriage with my business intact, my relationship with my children protected and undamaged, and a complete, undeniable record of the truth that no amount of Melissa's charm or Corbin Ash's legal manoeuvring was ever able to soften or rewrite. I want to say something here about the specific role the security footage played in all of this, because I think it is easy, hearing this story, to focus only on the drama of discovery and miss the more practical lesson underneath it, which is the one I actually want listeners to walk away with. The footage itself was never really the point. Lots of people discover infidelity through a text message, a receipt, a gut feeling that turns out to be correct. What mattered in my case was not that I found out. It was that what I found could never be taken back, altered, or denied, because it existed in a form completely outside Melissa's control from the very first second it was recorded. If I had relied only on the version of the footage in the consumer app on my own phone, the version Melissa also had access to, there is a real possibility she could have discovered it herself at some point during those 11 weeks, panicked, deleted it, and spent months afterward denying that anything had ever happened at all, leaving me with nothing but my own memory of a single grainy clip against her increasingly confident denials, a fight I might well have lost in the court of our own household, even if I never lost it in an actual courtroom. The backup system, the redundancy, the habit of professional caution I had built over 11 years of protecting other people's evidence, turned out to be the single most important decision I ever made in my own marriage, made years before I had any idea I would ever need it, which is, I think, the truest kind of protection there is. The kind you build before you know you'll need it, not after. I want to tell you about the day we sold the house on Willow Creek Lane, because it turned out to be one of the more unexpectedly difficult days of the entire year and a half, harder in some ways than the confrontation itself, and I did not see that coming until I was standing in it. This was in early December, about 2 months after the divorce was finalised, and the settlement had specified that the house would be sold and the proceeds divided according to the negotiated formula, since neither Melissa nor I could realistically afford to buy the other one out at the property's appraised value, and a young family with 2 small children, the husband a nurse at Mission Hospital, and the wife an occupational therapist, made an offer within the first 2 weeks of listing that both Melissa and I agreed, independently, was fair and worth accepting quickly, rather than dragging the process out. I remember walking through the empty house the morning of the closing, after the movers had already taken the last of our furniture to my new smaller rental a mile away, running my hand along the doorframe in the kitchen, where I had marked Ethan's and Zoe's heights every year since they could stand, a series of small pencil lines and dates that the new owners had asked, kindly and specifically, if they could keep rather than paint over, and I stood there for a long time in that empty kitchen, the same kitchen where I had once laid out a binder of evidence on the table, the same kitchen where Melissa had once cut cucumbers on a cutting board I bought her for our 5th anniversary, feeling the specific hollowed-out grief of leaving behind not the marriage, which I had already fully grieved by that point, but the physical container the marriage had happened inside, the actual walls that held 16 years of an ordinary, complicated, real life. Melissa came by that same morning to do her own final walkthrough an hour after mine. Our closing agent had arranged it that way deliberately so we would not have to cross paths, but I saw her car pull into the driveway as I was loading the last box into my truck, and we ended up standing together in the driveway for about 10 minutes, the first real, unhurried conversation we'd had in months that wasn't about custody logistics or legal paperwork. She told me she'd heard through Ethan that I was seeing someone, and she asked, with what sounded like genuine and uncomplicated warmth rather than any lingering possessiveness, whether Renee made me happy, and I told her honestly that it was still early, but that yes, so far she did. Melissa told me she was glad, and I believed her. And then she said something that I have carried with me since, standing in the driveway of the house we were both about to hand over to strangers, that she hoped someday I would be able to think about the good years, the actual 16 years, without the last one poisoning all the ones that came before it, because she said she thought about them that way herself, that she genuinely believed, whatever she had thrown away with her own choices, that most of those 16 years had been real, and she did not want either of us walking away from that house believing none of it had ever counted for anything. I did not fully agree with her in the moment, and I am not certain I fully agree with her even now, because I think there is a real and important difference between the 16 years being genuinely good while they were happening, and the 16 years being something I can look back on now without the specific, permanent asterisk her choices attached to all of it. But I told her, standing in that driveway with moving boxes stacked in the back of my truck, that I hoped, for her own sake, and for the sake of how our children would eventually remember their childhood, that she was right, that the good years counted because Ethan and Zoe were going to need to believe that their whole family history wasn't a lie just because it ended badly, and whatever I privately felt about how to weigh the good years against the ending, I was never going to be the parent who taught my kids to distrust every happy memory they had of their own childhood, simply because their mother made a devastating choice partway through it. We shook hands, oddly formal after 16 years of marriage, and she got into her car and drove to her new townhouse, and I got into my truck and drove to my new rental, and that was the last time either of us stood inside that house, the house where camera 3 had once shown me the worst thing I had ever seen, and where months later, in the same kitchen, I had shown her the proof that ended it, a house that now belongs to a nurse and an occupational therapist and their 2 small children, who I hope, sincerely, fill those rooms with a version of ordinary happiness as real and as lasting as the one I once believed, for 16 years, that I had built there myself. It has been a little over a year and a half now since that Tuesday afternoon in March when a motion alert from camera 3 changed the entire shape of my life, and I want to tell you where things stand now, because I think endings matter as much as beginnings do in a story like this one, and because I think a lot of people who find themselves at the start of something, like what I went through, need to hear that the other side of it is livable, even good, in ways you cannot possibly imagine while you're still sitting in a parking lot with your hands shaking on the wheel. Corwin Home Security has grown since the divorce. Not despite everything that happened, but in some strange way because of it. I threw myself into the business during the loneliest stretches of that first year alone in the house, and we picked up a significant regional contract with a chain of small medical offices across 3 counties that I had been chasing for 2 years before any of this happened. Work that finally came through, almost absurdly, during the exact month the divorce was finalised, and I have sometimes wondered whether the version of myself that emerged from those 11 weeks, calmer under pressure, more comfortable making difficult decisions methodically instead of emotionally, was simply better at running a business than the version of me that existed before any of it. Ethan is 17 now, a senior, being recruited by 2 smaller college baseball programs in the Carolinas, and he has grown, over the past year and a half, into a young man I am enormously proud of, steady in a way that reminds me sometimes of my own father, protective of his sister in a way I never had to teach him. He and I do not talk often about that spring. We have had exactly 2 real conversations about it in 18 months, both of them initiated by him, both of them short, and I have come to understand that this is simply how he processes difficult things, quietly and on his own schedule, and I have made my peace with not needing him to talk about it more than that as long as I can see, in the ordinary texture of his daily life, that he is doing okay. Zoe is 12 now, in 6th grade, and she has become, somewhat to my surprise, the more openly talkative of my 2 kids about what happened, asking me occasional direct questions over the past year, whether I'm lonely, whether I think I will ever get married again, whether she did the right thing telling her friend Ava at school the truth when Ava asked why she had 2 houses, and I have tried to answer every single one of those questions as honestly and calmly as I can, because I decided somewhere in that first difficult year that the version of honesty I owed my children was not the version that protected them from every hard feeling, but the version that showed them a father who could hold hard feelings steadily without being destroyed by them. Melissa and I have settled, over the past year and a half, into something I genuinely did not expect to be possible back in that kitchen in June, which is a working, cordial, entirely non-romantic co-parenting relationship that both of our children seem to find stable and reassuring rather than tense. She remarried no one, dated only briefly and quietly as far as I know, and threw herself, according to what Ethan and Zoe tell me, into her own therapy and into rebuilding a version of her real estate career that had suffered somewhat during the messier stretch of the divorce. We are able to sit at the same table now at Ethan's baseball games and at Zoe's middle school choir concerts. We exchange the ordinary logistical texts of shared custody without rancour, and once at Ethan's junior prom send-off in the driveway of my house last spring, both of us stood together taking pictures of our son in his rented tuxedo, laughing at the same joke he made about his date being taller than him in her heels, and I remember thinking in that specific unremarkable moment that whatever else had been lost in that kitchen a year earlier, we had at least managed to protect the one thing I had set out 11 weeks of careful, quiet work to protect from the very beginning, which was our children's ability to still have both of their parents, undamaged and present, in the ordinary, important moments of their lives. I've started seeing someone over the past 4 months, a woman named Renee Alvarez who teaches high school biology, and whom I met, unglamorously, through a mutual friend at a cookout. And I want to say honestly that it has taken me most of this past year and a half to feel ready for something like that, to trust my own judgment about another person again after learning, so completely and so late, how much I had missed about someone I thought I knew entirely. Renee knows the broad outline of my story, and she asked me once fairly early on whether I thought I would ever fully trust anyone again after everything, and I told her the truth, which is that I don't think trust works the way people assume it does after something like this. I don't think it comes back all at once in a single leap of faith. I think it gets rebuilt slowly, in small verified pieces, the way you'd rebuild a wall after a flood, one course of brick at a time, testing each layer before you add weight to the next one. And that I was willing to do that work again, slowly, with someone who seemed patient enough to let me do it at my own pace instead of demanding I simply decide to trust her the way I once decided, blindly and completely, to trust Melissa at 26 years old under a string of lights in a backyard in Weaverville. There is one more encounter I have not yet told you about, because I have gone back and forth for a long time about whether it belonged in this story at all, but I think it does, because it is the moment that finally completely closed something in me that had stayed quietly open since that Tuesday in March. It happened about 10 months after the divorce was finalised, in a hardware store on Hendersonville Road, the kind of ordinary Saturday morning errand I have run 1,000 times in my life. And I turned down the aisle with plumbing fixtures and found myself standing 4 feet away from Ryan Castellano, who was holding a package of pipe fittings and looking, for a full 3 seconds, like a man who very badly wanted the floor to open beneath him. I want to be honest that I had imagined this moment many times in the year since the divorce. Imagined myself saying something sharp, something that would land the way I felt he deserved to have something land on him, and what actually happened surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. I said nothing cruel. I looked at him, and he looked at me. And something passed between us that had no words attached to it at all. Just 2 men standing in a hardware store aisle, both fully aware of exactly what the other one knew. And after what felt like a very long 3 seconds, but was probably closer to 1, he said quietly, "David, I'm sorry for what it's worth." And I found that I believed him. Not in the sense that I forgave him. Forgiveness was never really his to ask for from me in the same direct way it was Melissa's, but in the sense that I believed the apology was genuine rather than performed. The words of a man who had, in the year since, apparently lost his own long-term relationship, watched his business take a real reputational hit in a city that talks, and had time to sit with the actual weight of what 14 months of calculated deception costs the people on the receiving end of it. I told him, and this is the entire extent of what I said, that I hoped he had learned something real from all of it, for his own sake and for whoever he ended up with next, and then I picked up the coupling I needed, paid at the register and drove home, and I remember sitting in my truck in my own driveway afterward, feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsettled in some low background way since that first Tuesday afternoon, a final, quiet confirmation that I did not need anything more from that man, not an apology, not an admission, not a public reckoning, in order to fully close that chapter and walk forward without him occupying any further space in my life at all. I want to talk, before I finish telling you this story, about the practical lessons underneath it, because I think they matter more than the specific details of my own marriage, and because I have had, in the year and a half since, more conversations than I can count with clients, friends of friends, people who find out what happened to me and want to ask careful, half-embarrassed questions about their own situations. The first lesson is one I have already told you. Evidence you cannot fully control is worth infinitely more than evidence you can. Whether that means a security system with an independent backup a spouse doesn't know exists, or simply the habit of quietly saving screenshots, statements, and documentation to a location outside a shared device the moment you suspect something is wrong, rather than confronting first and gathering proof second, because proof gathered after a confrontation is proof that has already been contaminated by warning. The second lesson is about time. 11 weeks felt in the moment like an eternity of quiet suffering, but it gave me something that acting on day one never could have given me: a complete, undeniable, legally sound picture of exactly what had happened, built with enough patience that no lawyer on the other side could later claim I had acted rashly, incompletely, or on incomplete information. The third lesson, and I think this one matters most, is about your children. Every decision I made in those 11 weeks, and in the months of legal proceedings that followed, was filtered through a single question. Will this protect Ethan and Zoe, or will it simply make me feel better in the short term at their expense? I did not always get that balance perfectly right. I am sure there were moments where my own pain leaked through in ways I wasn't fully aware of, but I tried every single day to hold that question in front of me before I acted, and I believe, a year and a half later, watching my son grow into a steady young man, and my daughter grow into a girl who says grace over Thanksgiving turkey with real conviction, that it was the right question to keep asking. I think about camera 3 sometimes, the actual physical device still mounted under the same eave it has been mounted under for going on 4 years now, still quietly recording an ordinary sunroom that gets used now mostly for Zoe's art projects, and Ethan doing homework with his cleats still on from practice. And I find it strange, in a way I don't fully know how to explain, that the single most consequential piece of technology in my entire adult life is a piece of hardware. I installed myself on an unremarkable Saturday afternoon, 2 years before I ever needed it for anything more dramatic than watching for raccoons near the trash cans. I did not build that backup system because I suspected my wife. I built it because building redundant, reliable systems is simply who I am, is the entire foundation of the business and the life I built, starting at 24 years old with 4 cameras and a used pickup truck. And I think that is, in the end, the truest thing I can tell anyone listening to this story. Whatever situation brought you here today, whatever you are currently afraid to look at directly in your own life, the habits you build when nothing is wrong are very often the exact habits that end up saving you when something finally is. People ask me, more often than I expected to be asked, whether I ever regret the 11 weeks of silence, whether some part of me wishes I had simply screamed the truth across that kitchen the very first night, instead of carrying it quietly for so long, and I want to answer that question as fully as I can, because I think the honest answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. There were nights during that period, particularly in the first few weeks, where the silence felt almost unbearable, where I would lie awake next to Melissa listening to her breathe and feel a kind of pressure behind my sternum that I can only compare to holding your breath underwater long after your body is screaming at you to surface. I remember one night in early April, unable to sleep, going downstairs at 2 a.m. and sitting alone in my dark kitchen, the same kitchen where, months later, I would finally lay that binder of evidence on the table and thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, that I could simply wake her up right then and say the words and end the unbearable pressure of carrying the secret alone. I did not do it. And I think the reason I did not do it is the same reason I want to leave with anyone listening to this, who finds themselves in a similarly unbearable stretch of waiting. The pressure of carrying a painful truth alone for a defined purposeful period of time is real, and it is hard, but it is temporary and it resolves, whereas the damage of acting too soon, without protection, without documentation, without a plan for your children, is very often permanent, and I decided, sitting in that dark kitchen at 2 a.m, that I would rather carry something heavy for 11 weeks than carry the much heavier weight of having acted carelessly for the rest of my life. I also want to talk about something that took me almost a full year to admit to myself, which is the particular grief of losing not just a marriage but a shared history, an entire private language built over 16 years that no one else in the world would ever fully understand the way Melissa and I once understood it together. Inside jokes about a terrible vacation rental in Myrtle Beach, a specific way she used to say my name when she was exasperated with me that I did not realize I would miss until I stopped hearing it, the particular choreography of 2 people who have shared a bathroom counter and a grocery list and a set of in-laws for 16 years. Renee, the woman I'm with now, said something to me a few months into our relationship that helped me more than she probably realizes, which is that grieving the loss of a shared history with someone does not mean you secretly want that person back. It simply means you are an ordinary human being who spent 16 years building something real, and real things, even ones that end badly, leave a mark when they're gone, and the mark is not evidence of a mistake. It is simply evidence that the years were not wasted even if the ending was ugly. I have found that framing enormously freeing, because for a long time I felt almost ashamed of moments where I missed some small, specific, ordinary thing about my marriage to Melissa, as though missing anything about her meant I hadn't fully processed what she'd done, and I don't believe that anymore. I believe you can miss pieces of a life you're glad you left, and that both of those feelings can sit honestly in the same chest without cancelling each other out. The same way, I eventually came to understand love and deception had apparently been sitting inside Melissa the entire time without cancelling each other out either. I think, if I'm honest with myself, that the single moment I am proudest of in this entire story is not the confrontation itself, dramatic as it was, and not the 11 weeks of careful documentation, methodical as they were. It is a much smaller, quieter moment that happened about 2 weeks after the divorce was finalised, when Ethan, home from school, asked me directly, for the first and only time, whether I hated his mother, and I told him no, and he asked me how that was possible after everything, and I told him something I'd been turning over in my mind for months and had never said aloud to anyone, not even Patricia, not even Gary. I told him that hating his mother would have required me to pretend that the 16 years before the affair had never happened, that none of it had been real, and that I was not willing to do that, because those 16 years had given me him and his sister, and a business I loved, and a version of my own adulthood I was genuinely proud of, and burning all of that down to justify hating one person for one specific, devastating set of choices felt like a worse betrayal of my own life than anything Melissa had done to me. I told him that you can hold someone fully accountable for real harm they caused you without deciding that every single year you spent with them was therefore fraudulent, and that learning to hold both of those things at once, the genuine good and the genuine harm, without collapsing one into the other, was probably the single hardest and most important thing his mother's affair had taught me, and that I hoped, whatever happened in his own life someday, he would remember that lesson longer than he remembered any of the painful details surrounding it. I have not yet told you about my own parents, and about Melissa's mother, and about the specific difficulty of watching people who love you absorb this kind of news, because I think that part of the story matters too, even though it happened mostly at the edges of the main events I've already described. My father, a retired electrician who taught me most of what I know about working carefully and methodically with my hands long before I ever picked up a security camera, took the news hard in a way I did not fully anticipate. He had loved Melissa, genuinely, for 16 years, had taught her to fish on the lake behind his property, had walked her partway down the aisle at our wedding when her own father's back gave him trouble that morning, and when I finally told my parents the full truth, sitting in their living room on a Sunday afternoon about 2 weeks after the confrontation, I watched my father's face go through something that looked almost like his own private grief, not just anger on my behalf, but a real mourning for a version of his daughter-in-law he had believed in completely. He asked me only one question that afternoon, whether I was certain, truly certain, beyond any possibility of misunderstanding, and when I told him about Camera 3, about the backup system, about Gary's surveillance photographs and the hotel statements and the discounted gym sessions, I watched something in his shoulders settle. Not relief exactly, but the specific grim comfort of a practical man learning that his son had handled an impossible situation the way he himself would have wanted to handle it, carefully, with proof, without letting rage make the first move. My mother's reaction was different and, in its own way, harder to sit through. She cried for almost 20 minutes, not delicately, and then she asked me in a voice thick with a kind of fierce protectiveness I hadn't heard from her since I was a teenager getting into trouble, whether there was anything she could do, anyone she needed to call, and I had to gently talk her down from what I genuinely believe would have been her showing up at Melissa's sister's house that same afternoon to say something she would have regretted. What she gave me instead, over the following months, was something quieter and more useful. An open invitation for Ethan and Zoe to spend weekend afternoons at her house, whenever the new custody schedule left gaps that needed filling, a standing offer of dinner on nights I clearly did not have the energy to cook, and a specific, steady kind of presence that asked nothing of me except permission to help, which I have come to understand in the year and a half since, is one of the most valuable things a parent can offer an adult child going through something like this. Not advice, not opinions about what I should have done differently, simply steady, uncomplicated help with the actual logistics of a life that had suddenly become much harder to run alone. Melissa's mother, a woman named Carol Hargrove, whom I had considered something close to a second mother for 16 years, handled it in a way that surprised me the most of anyone, because she called me directly about a month after the divorce filing, something Melissa herself did not know about until I mentioned it to her much later, and she told me, her voice unsteady but clear, that she had raised her daughter better than this, that she was ashamed, genuinely ashamed, of what Melissa had done, and that whatever happened between the two of us going forward, she wanted me to know that she considered Ethan and Zoe her grandchildren, regardless of any divorce decree, and that door would never close on my end if I needed anything at all involving them. I did not expect that call, and it moved me more than almost anything else that happened during those difficult months, because it told me that the people who had known Melissa longest and loved her most completely were also capable of holding her fully accountable, without excusing what she'd done simply because she was their daughter, and I have tried, in the year and a half since, to extend Carol the same steady respect she extended me that day, inviting her to Ethan's baseball games and Zoe's school concerts just as I always had, because whatever ended between her daughter and me, nothing about what happened was ever her fault, and I was not willing to let my children lose a grandmother over a mistake that belonged entirely to two other adults. There was also, in those first difficult months, the more ordinary and somehow more exhausting matter of our shared friend group, the couples we had known for years through the kids' school and through Melissa's real estate office, and through my own small business networking circles, all of whom eventually had to be told something, all of whom, in their own ways, had to decide where their loyalties and their comfort levels actually sat once the news became impossible to avoid. Some of those friendships did not survive the divorce intact, not out of any dramatic falling out, but simply because a couple we had known for a decade would end up hosting a barbecue and have to choose, uncomfortably, whether to invite Melissa or me, and more often than not, in the year that followed, I found myself quietly excluded from gatherings I would once have attended without a second thought. Not out of malice, I don't believe, but out of the ordinary social awkwardness of a friend group that had built itself around a couple that no longer existed. It stung more than I expected it to, losing pieces of a social world I had assumed was simply mine, independent of my marriage, and learning otherwise was one of the smaller, quieter griefs of that first year. One I don't think anyone warns you about ahead of time, that a divorce does not just cost you a spouse, it costs you a version of your community too, and rebuilding that community, slowly, with people like Gary and a handful of loyal friends who made the effort to stay close to both Melissa and me without turning it into a referendum, took nearly as long as rebuilding my own sense of who I was without her. I think, looking back across the full year and a half now, about the specific afternoon Gary and I spent installing a new camera system for a young couple in Weaverville, about 8 months after my own divorce was finalised. A routine job, 4 cameras and a video doorbell. Nothing unusual about it at all, except that partway through the installation the husband, a man about 10 years younger than me, asked me, almost sheepishly, whether these systems could be set up with any kind of backup that his wife wouldn't necessarily know about. And I felt something strange pass through me standing on that ladder, a recognition I did not expect to feel doing ordinary work on an ordinary Tuesday. I did not ask him why he wanted it. That has never been my business as an installer, but I walked him through the same redundant backup architecture I had built into my own house years earlier, without ever imagining I would need it myself. The cloud account, the physical drive, the separation between the consumer app and the administrator level access. And I found myself explaining it with a level of care and specificity that Gary noticed, glancing at me once with an expression that told me he understood exactly why I was being so thorough with this particular client. I do not know what that young husband eventually found, if anything, or whether his marriage is fine and this was simply an ordinary precaution born of ordinary anxiety rather than any real suspicion, but I know that I set up his system that day with the same quiet professional care I would want someone to take on my behalf, because I understood, in a way I could not have understood 2 years earlier, exactly how much can end up resting on whether a single backup system was built correctly before anyone ever needed it. I think about Ethan and Zoe most of all, though, when I try to take the full measure of this year and a half, because in the end they are the reason any of the 11 weeks of careful documentation mattered at all. Ethan will graduate high school next spring, and he has started talking tentatively about wanting to study construction management, following a path that looks a great deal like the one my own father laid down for me decades ago, and I have not pushed him toward it or away from it. I have simply tried to be the kind of steady, present father who shows up to every game he can make it to, who answers the phone every single time his son calls regardless of what else is happening. Because I decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that spring a year and a half ago, that the entire purpose of surviving it, intact, was to be exactly that kind of father, for as long as both my children needed one. Zoe, 12 now and utterly unafraid of saying exactly what she thinks, told me last month, apropos of nothing, while we were driving home from her orthodontist appointment, that she thought I had handled everything about the divorce, quote, like a real adult, unlike some of her friends' parents who, according to the merciless clarity of middle schoolers observing their friends' families, screamed at each other in parking lots and made everyone choose sides. I told her I appreciated that, and she said, matter-of-factly staring out the window, that she wanted to remember how I did it, in case she ever needed to do something hard like that herself someday. And I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else she has ever said to me, because it told me that somewhere in all that pain, my daughter had watched her father absorb the worst thing that ever happened to our family, and had come away from it not traumatized by how it was handled, but quietly instructed by it. And if that is the single lasting legacy of everything Camera 3 showed me on that Tuesday afternoon a year and a half ago, then I believe, without reservation, that every sleepless night of those 11 weeks was worth exactly what it cost me. Before I go, I want to say one more thing about the word betrayal, because it is a word people have used to describe my story more than any other single word since I first started telling pieces of it to people close to me. And I have come to believe it is only half correct. What happened to me was a betrayal without question, a real and serious one, sustained across roughly a year and a half by two people who each made repeated, deliberate choices to protect their own comfort at the direct expense of a family that trusted them completely. But I do not want the word betrayal to be the only word anyone takes away from this story, because if it is, I think the lesson gets smaller than it should be. The word I would add beside it, the one I think about more now, a year and a half later, is preparation. Because in the end, betrayal is something that happens to you, something outside your control, delivered by someone else's choices on a Tuesday afternoon you never asked for. Preparation is the only part of this entire story that was ever actually mine. The only part I built with my own hands, in the dark, quietly, over 11 exhausting weeks, and it is the only part of the whole ordeal I would tell anyone listening to genuinely take pride in, because betrayal will always be about what someone else did to you. But preparation is about who you decide to be in response to it, and that decision, unlike the betrayal itself, is one nobody can ever take away from you once you've made it. That is the whole of it. From a Tuesday afternoon motion alert to a hardware store aisle a year and a half later, from a folder of evidence on a kitchen table to a daughter saying grace over a Thanksgiving turkey with real conviction in her voice. And if there is one thing I hope stays with you after hearing all of it, it is simply this. The worst moment of your life does not have to become the moment that defines the rest of it, as long as you're willing to meet it slowly, carefully, and completely, instead of letting it rush you into becoming someone you won't recognize a year from now. Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. I want to close this out by telling you about a very specific evening about 3 weeks ago, because I think it captures, better than any single summary I could give you, where all of this has actually landed. It was a Tuesday, the same day of the week that started this entire story a year and a half earlier, and I found myself standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen, making dinner for Ethan and Zoe on one of my custody weeks. And Zoe was doing homework at the counter, and Ethan was in the garage hitting the ball against the side of the house the way he still does sometimes even now, less out of unresolved anger these days, and more, I think, out of simple habit and love for the sound of it. And my phone buzzed with a motion alert from Camera 3. The same camera, the same alert sound I have heard thousands of times in the year and a half since March, and this time it was nothing at all. A neighbour's cat picking its way along the fence line in the late afternoon light, and I stood there for a moment looking at that harmless, ordinary clip. A cat on a fence, nothing more, and I felt something in my chest that I have been waiting a year and a half to feel again without reservation, which was simply peace, uncomplicated and total. The specific peace of a man standing in a kitchen he fought hard to keep, watching harmless footage of an ordinary Tuesday with both of his children safe under the same roof, and no secret sitting underneath any of it waiting to surface. I do not know what Renee and I will become over the coming years, whether we will eventually build something as permanent as what I once believed I had with Melissa, and I have made a kind of peace with that uncertainty that I don't think I could have made a year and a half ago, back when I believed, with total unexamined confidence, that certainty about another person was even something a marriage was supposed to provide. I know now that certainty was never really the thing 16 years with Melissa gave me, even in the years before anything went wrong. What it gave me was simply 16 years, real ones, some of them among the best of my life, and an ending that taught me at real and lasting cost exactly how to protect what actually matters when the thing you least expect finally happens to you. I know that if I ever need to trust that kind of instinct again, the quiet, patient, methodical instinct that got me through 11 weeks without breaking and without losing anything I couldn't afford to lose, I have it now in a way I didn't fully have it before, tested and proven under the worst pressure of my adult life. And that is not nothing. That might in fact be the single most valuable thing that entire ordeal left behind once the pain of it finally settled into something more like scar tissue than open wound. To anyone listening to this who recognizes any piece of their own life in what I've just told you, a gut feeling you've been talking yourself out of for months, a pattern of small unexplained absences, a partner who has started guarding their phone in a way they never used to, I want to leave you with the same three things Patricia Hensley's guidance, Gary's steady friendship, and 11 weeks of hard, lonely discipline eventually left me with. Document before you confront, because evidence gathered after a confrontation is evidence that has already been compromised by warning. Build redundancy into anything that matters to you before you ever suspect you'll need it, whether that's a security system, a financial record, or simply your own clear-eyed memory of dates and details, because the version of protection you build in calm times is always stronger than anything you can improvise in a crisis. And above everything else, whatever you eventually decide to do with what you find, decide it slowly enough that you can still respect the person you were in the decision a year later, because rage fades, humiliation fades, even grief eventually dulls into something more manageable. But the decisions you make in the rawest, most wounded version of yourself are the ones you will have to live with the longest, and they deserve more patience than your pain will initially want to give them. My name is David Corwin. I run a security company in Asheville, North Carolina. I have 2 children. I would do all of this again without a single second of hesitation, and a year and a half ago, a motion alert from a camera I mounted with my own hands showed me the worst thing I'd ever seen in my own home, and instead of breaking, I built something quieter and stronger underneath the wreckage of it. One careful, documented, patient week at a time, until the truth I already knew became a truth no one could ever again convince me, or my children, or a court of law, to doubt. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that patience and quiet preparation can be its own form of strength when everything in you wants to scream, subscribe to this channel for a new true story every single day, because there are a great many more people out there who found the courage to protect themselves and their families the same slow, careful way I did, and their stories deserve to be heard just as much as mine did.